Gerald Murphy's life crumbles when his wife leaves him for his boss. Alone and shattered, he retreats to a remote cabin, but the past haunts him. Seeing his ex-wife with her new lover on TV reignites his pain. Meanwhile, Gwen Lambert, a single mother, struggles with a husband in prison and a growing connection with Gerald. As betrayal and secrets collide, they face a choice: remain trapped in the past or fight for a new future. At 35, Gerald Murphy found himself in a tough spot, having lost his dignity, job, family, and most of his savings in a divorce. People called him Jerry, a name he disliked, but that was the least of his worries. Despite his loyalty and dependability, his intense focus on work had isolated him, leading to his wife leaving him for one of his former bosses. With his children now living 600 miles away, Gerald was left alone in a small town, jobless and without direction. When the economy tanked and his factory closed, Gerald sold his house, bought a small cabin on 5 acres, and tried to start over. One night, frustrated by a smug TV commentator, he impulsively shot his television. The next morning, determined to regain control, he bought gardening supplies and started cultivating his land. At an estate sale, he offered to clear out a barn and tear down a shed for $200. Among the clutter, he found useful items like metal fence poles, garden tools, and a small trailer. Over the next few months, he took on more similar jobs, earning money and materials for his projects. As his garden grew, so did his resolve, turning his simple life into one of quiet productivity. He found a lawnmower that was said to be broken, but with a quick oil change and a new spark plug, it worked perfectly. As his garden flourished, he realized he needed to preserve his vegetables. The local library provided books on canning and preserving, and soon he was storing his harvest, though space became an issue. To solve this, he built a sturdy, partially underground storage shed using collected materials. He established a routine, working 6 days a week and taking the 7th for household chores. He also learned to bake bread, making enough for the week on his day off. Every week he wrote letters to his children, though they eventually returned marked "moved, no forwarding address." Undeterred, he kept the letters in boxes, one for each child. During a trip to town, he found a small farmer's market open on Saturdays. He began baking 10 loaves of bread weekly to sell there, offering darker varieties like multigrain and rye. His bread quickly became popular, selling out most weekends. These efforts connected him with the community, where his warm personality began to shine. The women at the market, particularly appreciative of his bread, soon asked for his help with gardening projects. Gerald built raised garden beds and performed small repairs for them, earning extra income. Over 2 months, he constructed and delivered 12 garden beds, charging $75 each, and often making between $100 and $150 per house visit. As the holiday season approached, Gerald took a break and reviewed his finances, finding he had $12,000 in savings, a pleasant surprise after living simply for 9 months. Overcome with emotion, he wept tears of gratitude. For Christmas, he treated himself to an internet connection and attended a community event where he met more neighbors, including Gwen Lambert, a single mother and school teacher, and her shy daughter Sherilyn. Their connection marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. They exchanged numbers and agreed to call if they needed help. 2 days later, Gwen called Gerald, explaining that her brother and sister-in-law had canceled their Christmas plans due to an emergency, leaving her with too much food for just her and her daughter. She invited Gerald to join them for Christmas dinner. Though he hesitated, he eventually agreed, offering to bring some bread. On Christmas Day, as Gerald approached her house, he noticed smoke coming from a window. He rushed inside to find Gwen sitting on the kitchen floor, distraught, with the stove charred and covered in fire extinguisher foam. He quickly got Gwen and her daughter, Sherilyn, outside to safety. After checking the kitchen and turning off the gas, Gerald reassured Gwen that they could finish the meal at his place. They packed the turkey and headed to Gerald's cabin, where he helped prepare a simple but satisfying dinner. The warmth of the meal and Gerald's hospitality lifted their spirits. After dinner, Gerald showed Sherilyn his garden while Gwen shared her troubles with him. She explained how her husband had lost his job, spiraled into a bad situation, and was now facing prison time, leaving her worried about how to manage. Gerald listened empathetically and offered to help find a new stove for her. They made plans to clean up Gwen's kitchen the next day, and she agreed to bring sausage and eggs for breakfast. The next morning, they worked well together in Gerald's kitchen, making breakfast and enjoying the comfort of each other's company. Both Gwen and Sherilyn enjoyed the biscuits and gravy, a new treat for them. After breakfast, they headed to Gwen's house to clean up. Gerald hauled the old stove to his truck, planning to recycle it. They cleaned the kitchen, and after lunch, Gerald removed the damaged wallboard, finding that some beams and insulation needed replacing. The next morning, he bought supplies and completed the repairs by the end of the day. Gwen and Sherilyn joined him for meals each day, and by the weekend, Gerald had installed a new stove he found at a thrift store for $100. Gwen was thrilled with the find and its functionality, agreeing to repay Gerald $20 a month. Grateful, she invited him to a New Year's party, but Gerald offered to watch Sherilyn instead. On New Year's Eve, Sherilyn and Gerald made homemade pizzas and bonded over shared stories. Gwen returned from her party early, bringing sparkling juice to celebrate with them. They toasted the new year together and shared warm embraces before Gwen and Sherilyn headed home. On New Year's Day, Gerald built an outdoor brick oven, believing it would improve his bread. He sold out all 20 loaves at the next farmer's market. Gwen invited him over for a Sunday dinner of enchiladas and tacos, wrapping up the holiday season. The following week, a cold front hit, and Gerald spent most of his time delivering seasoned firewood to those in need. Gerald made nearly $1,000 that week, which was a relief since his bread sales had slowed at the farmer's market. With no calls for raised bed gardens in over a month, he prepared a dozen frames for spring. The cold weather halted his oven project, so he spent his time experimenting with new bread recipes. As school resumed, he saw less of Gwen and Sherilyn, though they kept in touch by phone and began a routine of Friday and Sunday dinners together. As January turned into February, calls for garden beds picked up. With the frames ready, Gerald quickly set up gardens and planted his own crops. One day, Gwen and Sherilyn came home to find a freshly tilled garden along their fence, a surprise from Gerald. The next day, Sherilyn, who had no school, helped him plant it. Gwen had wanted a garden but lacked the time and tools. Now, thanks to Gerald, she had one. A month later, during spring break, Gwen told Gerald she would be away for her husband's trial. Gerald assured her he would take care of their place. After they left, he felt a bit lonely but soon became busy with work. When Gwen called on Thursday night, she sounded strained. Gerald offered to have dinner ready when they returned the next day. They arrived late Friday, and Gerald, noticing their stress, focused on making dinner without asking questions. The meal was calm, and by the time they left, some of the tension had lifted. Gwen mentioned she would share more on Sunday. On Saturday, Gerald sold all his bread at the market and spent Sunday in his garden. Later, Gwen confided that the trial had been tough. Her husband was sentenced to 5 years, though he might be out in 3 with good behavior. It was a hard blow for both Gwen and Sherilyn. Gwen admired Gerald's ability to stay kind and non-judgmental, even in difficult times. Gerald quietly thanked her and offered to pick up anything she needed while in town. She declined, and they agreed to meet for dinner at 6:30. "I hope Sherilyn feels better tonight. I'll be there. And if she doesn't, that's okay. It's tough on you, but I can only imagine how hard it is for her." Gerald didn't know how to respond, so he hugged Gwen briefly before returning to his work. Her words lingered in his mind, making him reflect on how he always tried to understand situations before making judgments. Sometimes he wondered if this made him indecisive, a trait his ex-wife had criticized. That evening, they had a pleasant dinner, and although Sherilyn seemed a bit brighter, she was still subdued. Gerald hoped that school and friends would help lift her spirits. Gwen asked if Sherilyn could stay with him on Thursday while she attended a training session. Gerald agreed, pleased to spend time with the gentle girl. Early in the week, Gerald was busy clearing out a barn when he discovered an old tractor. The owner, who never had time to fix it up, offered it to Gerald instead of payment. Gerald accepted, collected the tractor and some materials, and began planning a barn to protect it from the elements. On Thursday, he marked the spot for the barn and started digging. When Sherilyn got home, she joined him, curious about the project. Gerald patiently explained his plans, answering her many questions. They spent about 30 minutes talking before heading inside to prepare dough for Saturday's bread. Sherilyn continued asking questions, particularly about the ingredients, often starting with why. Gerald did his best to answer, though some questions stumped him. As they made dinner, Sherilyn worked on her homework, still full of why questions. When Gwen arrived, Gerald was explaining multiplication to Sherilyn using dried beans. After dinner, he showed Sherilyn how the bread dough had doubled in size, answering yet another why question. For the first time since she got home, Sherilyn smiled and thanked him with a hug. As they left, Gerald realized that this might be Sherilyn's first step in understanding the complex situations in her life. She wasn't ready for all the answers yet, but she was starting to learn, and Gerald felt happy to be the one guiding her. The next afternoon, as Gerald took the last loaves of bread from the oven, Sherilyn approached him. "Gerald, Mom wants to know if you'll come for dinner. She's making spaghetti, and it'll be ready soon. Let me put these loaves on the cooling rack, and we can walk up together. Gerald, I got 100 on my math test today." "Congratulations, that's great. Did the beans on the table help you understand?" "Yes, they made everything click. I don't think you can do anything wrong, Gerald." He smiled. "Most of us don't do many things wrong, but sometimes even when we do things right, they don't turn out as expected. Let me show you." He brought her to the cooling rack. "See this loaf? We made it just like the others, but it didn't rise properly. Sometimes things go wrong for reasons we don't anticipate. The taste is still good, though it looks different. Now let's head to your mom's before we're late." Grabbing a bottle of wine and a loaf of Italian bread, they walked to Gwen's house, where they were welcomed with a warm smile. The following week, Gerald completed 2 garden bed jobs. After finishing at the second house, a woman asked if he could remove an overgrown bush, which he quickly dug up and planted along his driveway, sparking his interest in creating non-food gardens. He spent the rest of the week working on his tractor and the barn, a timber frame structure needing additional rafters for the roof. Disappointed by the cost of new rafters, Gerald sought a more affordable solution. While at the metal recycler, he spotted a truck carrying materials from a demolished warehouse. He purchased 15 trusses for $500, though they were longer than needed. He decided to make the roof slanted, using a boat winch and a ramp to lift the beams. After 2 days of work, the beams were secured, and within a week, the metal roof was complete. Gwen and Sherilyn praised his work, noting how the roof perfectly matched the surrounding hill. During this time, Sherilyn began visiting more often, proudly sharing her perfect test scores with Gerald. He found comfort in these moments, worrying less about the future. Gerald realized he could solve almost any problem he faced. In April, Gwen came to him with news. "Gerald, they're moving Jim to a prison 50 miles away. I can visit him once a month, but I'm not sure how Sherilyn will feel about going every time. Would it be okay if she stayed with you every other month?" "Of course, Gwen. Just let me know when you need me," Gerald replied. Gwen expressed her gratitude, mentioning how curious Sherilyn had become, asking questions about everything from the barn to baking bread. Gerald shyly admitted he enjoyed helping her, especially when he knew the answers. Gwen smiled warmly, telling him, "You're really special, Gerald. I don't think you realize that." That Saturday, Sherilyn accompanied Gerald to the farmer's market while Gwen visited the prison. At the market, Sherilyn proudly explained to a friend how she helped make the bread, impressing the parents enough that they bought 2 loaves. Afterward, Gerald treated Sherilyn to lunch, where she surprisingly didn't eat the bun with her hot dog. "Why aren't you eating the bun?" Gerald asked. "Since I started eating your bread, the buns just don't taste good anymore. Why don't you make hot dog and hamburger buns?" Sherilyn replied, sparking an idea in Gerald's mind. Later, back home, Gerald used beans to help Sherilyn with her division homework. Gwen, arriving to see them working together, laughed and invited Gerald to stay for dinner. He accepted, bringing some frozen bread dough to experiment with. The next morning, Gerald baked 12 buns, carefully monitoring the smaller dough. Some turned out well, while others looked like mini loaves. At noon, he invited Gwen and Sherilyn over for burgers and hot dogs, and Gwen brought potato salad. When they arrived, Gerald was deep in thought by the grill. Sherilyn asked what he was thinking about, and he mentioned her idea about the buns. As they sat down to eat, Gerald revealed oval-shaped buns, perfectly suited for both hot dogs and burgers. Sherilyn's eyes lit up with delight as she eagerly assembled her meal, while Gwen looked on, impressed by Gerald's creativity and Sherilyn's excitement. Gwen took a bun, added an oval burger, and topped it with lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and ketchup. She was impressed that the bun held everything without spilling and didn't fall apart like store-bought buns. The burger tasted perfect, though the bun had a slightly sweeter taste and different texture. They laughed at the funny shapes of the burgers and buns. "Okay, Mr. Chef, how did you make these? They're really good," Gwen asked. Gerald smiled. "It's all Sherilyn's fault." "Me? I didn't do anything," Sherilyn replied. "Yes, you did. You said the hot dog buns didn't taste good anymore and suggested I make buns like my bread. So last night I tried different ways to make them, and this morning I baked them. But a round burger didn't fit, so I made them oval. I'm going to call them Sherry buns." Sherilyn squealed with joy, and Gwen smiled at her daughter and Gerald. Gerald then asked Sherilyn, "What did I do after I baked the buns?" "You cut them in half," she replied. "Exactly, you divided them. You do division every day without realizing it." Sherilyn's eyes lit up. "Hey, that's pretty neat. Division isn't as tough as they said it would be." "See? It's easy once you get it," Gerald said, pleased with her understanding. Gwen suggested, "These buns could be used as dinner rolls, sandwich rolls, or a lot of other things. You should try selling them at the market." "Thanks, I was thinking about that. I'll keep working on them," Gerald replied. On Monday, Gerald experimented with different methods for making the buns while working in his garden and Gwen's. One batch turned out light but sturdy, perfect for holding together. He decided to make a few dozen more to sell at the market on Saturday. Afterward, he tackled his tax return but got overwhelmed, fearing he owed $5,000. A meeting with his accountant relieved his worries. He owed nothing and even learned how to optimize his finances. The accountant suggested building a separate kitchen for baking, which sparked a new idea in Gerald's mind. Over the next weeks, he sold half of the 30 buns he brought to the market and gave away the rest as samples. The following week, he received orders for nearly 200 buns as grilling season spiked demand. Realizing he needed more space, Gerald began envisioning a new kitchen and bedroom, turning his current rooms into a dining and living area. As he made plans, he decided to charge $4 for 6 buns, feeling more confident about his future. Gerald wondered if people would pay $4 for 6 buns, so he created a flexible pricing plan, allowing customers to buy in smaller quantities. Many of his customers were singles or couples, so this approach seemed better suited to their needs. On Wednesday night, Sherilyn came over to help him roll out dough for Thursday's baking. She returned the next night to assist again, while Gwen had meetings and school events. Gerald made light dinners for Gwen each night, which she appreciated, and in return, she promised to make dinner for them on Friday. On Saturday, Gerald sold all his buns at the farmer's market. On his way home, he stopped at Gwen's house and gave Sherilyn $40 for her help. Despite Gwen's protests, Gerald insisted, explaining that Sherilyn had earned it by saving him valuable time. On Sunday, Gwen and Sherilyn visited Gerald, who was enjoying tea on his porch. Sherilyn proudly announced that she was going to treat them to dinner at a Mexican restaurant with her earnings, as long as she saved half. Gerald, impressed, agreed but suggested she save some money for herself in the future. That evening, they all went out to dinner, and Gerald discreetly made sure the bill would be within Sherilyn's budget by covering part of it without her noticing. After dinner, Sherilyn beamed with pride, having paid for their meal. Over the next few weeks, Gerald focused on baking bread, keeping up with his garden, but had to decline 2 barn cleaning jobs. 2 local hamburger restaurants approached him at the market about supplying buns, but Gerald realized that if he accepted, he'd lose touch with the community he loved. He decided to pass on the offer. At the next market, a man introduced himself as Bill Mednick, the sales manager for Sun States Baking. Bill had heard about Gerald's buns from the local restaurants and was impressed. He offered to buy the rights to the Sherry buns to produce and sell them regionally, acknowledging the unique appeal Gerald had created. Gerald was tempted to agree immediately, but took a moment before responding, "I might be. What do you have in mind?" The sales manager offered $25,000 for the recipe and the rights to the name Sherry Buns. Gerald, wanting to consider his options, replied, "That's generous, but let me talk to my accountant and business advisor on Monday. I'll call you in the afternoon." The sales manager understood and gave Gerald his card before they parted ways. Feeling elated, Gerald wanted to share the news with Gwen and Sherilyn, but remembered they were visiting the prison that weekend. Instead, he arranged to meet with his accountant, who suggested a different approach, offering the bakery a 10-year deal with a royalty of $0. 0.1 per bun sold instead of a lump sum. This way, both parties would share the risk, and if sales were high, Gerald could earn more than $25,000. The accountant also recommended including Sherilyn in the earnings, setting up a college fund for her, which would be tax-efficient until she finished high school. Gerald liked these ideas, but wanted to keep the right to sell up to 200 buns each week at the market, as many of his loyal customers preferred to buy in small quantities. Satisfied with his plan, he returned home to find a note inviting him to dinner at Gwen's. Over a meal of spaghetti, Gerald finally shared his news. "I'm selling the rights to my bun recipe to a bakery," he announced. Gwen congratulated him, and Sherilyn, concerned, asked if that meant they wouldn't be making buns anymore. Gerald reassured her, "I'm keeping the right to make buns for the market. You'll still be my baking buddy." He then explained his plan to give a third of the royalties to Sherilyn, setting up a college fund in her name. Gwen was moved to tears, deeply touched by Gerald's generosity. Sherilyn, though initially confused, was encouraged by her mother to continue doing well in school to possibly earn a scholarship. Gerald smiled, confident he was doing the right thing for their future. On Monday morning, Gerald called Bill Mednick at 9 a.m. Mednick was surprised but pleased to hear from him so early. When Gerald proposed his new offer, which included a 10-year royalty deal instead of a lump sum, Mednick was intrigued. He quickly called back and accepted the proposal, agreeing to have the paperwork ready by the end of the week. Gerald invited him to visit on Thursday to see the bun-making process, and Mednick promised to try. Afterward, Gerald spent the day installing gardens, feeling optimistic about the future. Meanwhile, Gwen decided to teach summer school for extra income, and Sherilyn stayed with Gerald during the mornings while Gwen worked. Gerald adjusted his schedule to include gardening and dough-making with Sherilyn's help. She eagerly learned about various subjects, from plants to chemistry and math, and by summer's end, her writing had improved significantly. When Gwen and Sherilyn visited Gwen's parents for a week, Gerald found the time lonely despite staying busy. Upon their return, he prepared a special dinner to welcome them back. As fall approached, Gerald began building an addition to his house. He completed the exterior and roof before the rains, finishing the interior quickly thanks to the proximity of the new kitchen to the old one. They celebrated Thanksgiving at Gwen's house, but Gerald hosted Christmas dinner in his newly remodeled dining room. He gave Sherilyn her first royalty check from the bakery, a share of $250, which thrilled both her and Gwen. They eagerly planned to deposit it in Sherilyn's college fund. As the new year approached, Gerald finished a new room in his house just in time for a housewarming party on New Year's Eve, complete with the first fire in his stone fireplace. In the following years, Gerald's success continued. He planted seeds early, growing more plants than needed, which he sold quickly at the market. Encouraged by this, he planned to build a greenhouse, collecting used windows to start the project. Sherilyn frequently helped with both the baking and building, learning hands-on skills that improved her school performance. By April, the Buns had brought in another royalty check, $3,000 for Gerald and $1,500 for Sherilyn's account. Gwen was amazed by the Buns' success. Throughout the year, they continued to work together, celebrating holidays and milestones as they built a life filled with hard work, learning, and shared joy. Like previous years, Christmas was joyful, especially since the latest royalty check was the largest yet, adding $6,000 to Gerald's account and $3,000 to Sherilyn's college fund. The third year started well, but in February, Gerald received a midday call from Gwen. "Gerald? I just got a call from the prison. Something happened, and I need to go there. Can you look after Sherilyn for a couple of days? I don't know how long I'll be away." "Of course, Gwen. I'll take care of things here," Gerald reassured her. That afternoon, Gerald picked up Sherilyn from school instead of waiting for the bus. She was happy to see him but became quiet after he explained the situation. Once home, she changed clothes while Gerald made tea. They sat on the porch, and Sherilyn asked, "Gerald, I know my dad loves us, but he does things that hurt. Why?" Gerald gently explained that sometimes people's actions, even when well-intended, can hurt others. "I don't know your dad, but maybe he's upset because he can't be with you and your mom." "You don't do things like that," she responded. "Sometimes people hurt others without meaning to." "Is there someone at school who makes you feel uneasy?" Gerald asked. Sherilyn mentioned a girl who made her uncomfortable, though the girl had never done anything wrong. Gerald suggested that perhaps the girl felt the same way about Sherilyn, and maybe talking to her would help them both understand each other better. Sherilyn thought about it but didn't respond. Later, Gerald suggested they go into town for Mexican food, which lifted Sherilyn's spirits. After preparing bread dough, they headed to dinner. At the restaurant, a woman approached Gerald to compliment his buns and ask about his burgers. As they talked, Sherilyn noticed a girl sitting alone and realized it was the girl they had discussed earlier. Excusing herself, Sherilyn introduced herself to the girl, named Jennifer, and invited her to join them. Soon, Sherilyn returned to the table with Jennifer, who needed help with fractions. Sherilyn asked if Jennifer could come over the next day for help with math. Gerald agreed, but suggested they check with Jennifer's mom, who turned out to be the woman Gerald had been speaking with. After some consideration, Jennifer's mom agreed, and Gerald offered to make dinner for the girls. Grateful, Jennifer's mom accepted the offer, and the plan was set for the next day. "I'd like that a lot," Jenny replied. Gerald smiled and said, "I'll pick you both up after school." The girls beamed and returned to their table. Jennifer's mom continued, "You have a lovely daughter, Gerald. Jenny is shy and doesn't have many friends at school. I'm glad she and Sherilyn are getting along. Thank you, but she's not my daughter. I live next door to her and her mom, Gwen Lambert," Gerald explained. "Oh, I met Gwen at a PTA meeting. I really like her. I heard she had an emergency with her husband," the woman inquired, clearly fishing for more information. Gerald replied carefully, "Yes, she had a family emergency, but I don't know the details. I'm just helping out by looking after Sherilyn." "It's nice that she trusts you so much. We should get going now. I'll make sure Jenny is picked up before 7 o'clock, the woman said as she gathered her things. "It was great talking to you, and I'll take good care of Jennifer while she's here," Gerald assured her. Once in the truck, Gerald asked Sherilyn, "Do you want to tell me about it?" Sherilyn, barely containing her excitement, explained, "I thought about what you said, so I went to talk to her. Jenny was surprised but happy I came over. She's shy like me and struggles with math, especially fractions. I told her how much you helped me, and she asked if you could help her too. I said you would. Can we have sherry buns for dinner tomorrow? Her mom can't make burgers like you." Gerald chuckled at her enthusiasm. "So, you're not scared of her anymore?" "Oh no, she's just quiet like me. She was worried because I do well in math and she's been struggling. Usually her dad helps her, but he's busy running for sheriff." "What's a sheriff, Gerald?" Gerald explained that a sheriff is like the head of the police for the whole county, not just the city. Sherilyn understood, and they drove home quietly, though Gerald could tell she was excited about making a new friend. The next day, Gerald baked a fresh batch of sherry buns and picked up the girls from school. They chatted non-stop on the way home. Sherilyn proudly showed Jennifer the brick oven and garden. Inside, Gerald had set up a table for their math session. For the next 2 hours, they worked on fractions, gradually seeing understanding grow in Jennifer's eyes. After finishing their homework, Gerald went outside to prepare the grill. Just as the grill was heating up, a car pulled into the driveway. Jennifer recognized it immediately and ran to greet her father, who was running for sheriff. "Daddy, this is Gerald. He helped me understand fractions today. I can do them now," she said excitedly. "And this is Sherilyn, my new friend." Gerald shook hands with the man, who introduced himself as Jim Sanders. "Nice to meet you, Jim. I'm Gerald Murphy." "Oh, you're the one I've heard about. You do gardens and make bread, right? Everything I've heard has been good," Jim replied with a grin. Gerald invited him to join them for burgers, and Jim gladly accepted, joking about needing to find better places to eat if he won the election. Gerald sent the girls inside to grab more burgers and set the table, and they quickly complied, excited for the evening ahead. "So, Jim, I take it your wife was a bit concerned about your daughter visiting a single guy?" Gerald asked with a smile. Jim chuckled. "You got it. Pam was thrilled Jenny made a friend, but when she heard Sherilyn was staying here while her mom was away, she had a few reservations. She watches a lot of crime shows and tends to be cautious." "No trouble at all," Gerald assured him. "With so many uncertainties out there, it's good to be careful. We worked on fractions and the girls did their homework just fine. They're both great kids." "Jenny is a good girl, just a bit shy. I'm glad she's so happy with Sherilyn. Running for office has taken up more time than I expected. I miss helping her with homework. Math has always been tough for her, so I'm glad you're helping out." "It's no trouble for me," Gerald replied. They chatted while the burgers cooked, and soon Gerald invited Jim inside, where the girls were happily chatting at the table. Gerald set the food down, and just as they were about to start eating, Gwen's car pulled up. "Sherry, I think your mom is back. Why don't you go greet her?" Gerald suggested. Sherilyn ran outside to greet Gwen, pulling her inside with a big hug. Gerald noticed Gwen looked tired but managed a warm smile as Sherilyn introduced her to Jennifer and Jim. Jim stood and shook Gwen's hand, and everyone was pleasantly surprised when Jennifer said, "Hello, Miss Lambert. I've missed you this year. You're the best teacher I've ever had." Gwen smiled warmly. "Thank you, Jennifer. How's school going for you this year?" "Pretty good, especially after Gerald helped me with math today," Jennifer replied. Gwen gave Gerald a grateful smile. "So your student load has doubled." Gerald blushed, and Sherilyn added, "They won't let me be in Mom's class. They worry I might not take it seriously." The adults laughed, and Gerald pulled up a chair for Sherilyn between the two girls. "Thanks, Gerald. I'm so hungry. I didn't feel like eating all day," Gwen said. Jim added, "Try these beans. They're amazing. The potato wedges are great, too." "Where did you get these beans, Gerald? I'd love to find some for home," Jim asked. "I actually grew them myself and have been experimenting with different spices," Gerald replied. "Well, I really like this recipe. If you ever decide to share, I'll be the first to buy some," Jim said. Everyone settled into the meal, and Gerald noticed that some of the tiredness faded from Gwen's face as they all enjoyed the light-hearted conversation. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Jim's phone rang. "Oops, my better half wants to know where we are," Jim said, excusing himself to take the call. After a brief conversation, he returned to the table. "We've been married for 10 years, and she still feels the need to check up on me." Silence fell over the table, except for the girls, who continued their lively conversation. Jim finally got up and told Jennifer it was time to go. He shook hands with Gwen and Gerald, wishing them a good night. Jennifer eagerly expressed her excitement to see Sherilyn at school the next day, and the girls shared a warm hug before she left with her dad. As they watched the car drive away, Sherilyn held her mom's hand. Gwen then turned to her. "Sherry, I need to talk to Gerald for a bit. Can you go inside and use the computer while I chat with him?" "Sure, Mom," Sherilyn said, but her expression darkened as she asked, "Is Daddy okay?" "Yes, dear. He was hurt, but he'll be fine," Gwen reassured her. "Okay, Jennifer talks a lot about her dad, but I didn't want to tell her about mine," Sherilyn admitted before heading inside. Gerald moved a rocking chair next to his and sat down, and Gwen joined him. "I'm not ready to talk just yet. Can you tell me about Sherry and her new friend?" she asked. Gerald shared the details of their conversation and how Sherilyn had initiated the meeting with Jennifer. Gwen nodded with a smile on her face. "Now I want to talk," Gerald said. "When I spoke with Jennifer's mom last night, it seemed like she was trying to find out more about your emergency trip." "I tried to downplay it," Gerald began, "but I'm not sure I did a great job. When I mentioned that Sherry is your daughter, not mine, I think Jenny's mom might have gotten the wrong idea about us. I tried to deny it, but you might hear some rumors." Gwen nodded. "It's okay. I've heard similar things. I met Jenny's mom at the PTA and I got the same feeling. But I like Jim. He seems like a good guy, just like you." "Yes, I feel the same," Gerald agreed. Gwen took a deep breath before continuing. "When I got to the prison, I found out Jim was in the hospital after a serious incident. He got involved with one of those groups and was hurt. But worse, he caused harm to someone. Now, he's facing manslaughter charges, which could add 10 to 15 years to his sentence." When I spoke to him, he apologized and told me I should get a divorce and move on with my life. He knows he messed up again and that it'll be a long time before he gets out. I cried all night at the motel. Gerald, what should I do? I didn't marry him to leave when things got tough, but this is too much. I don't want Sherry around him if he stays involved with those kinds of people. I'm scared and confused. Tears welled up in Gwen's eyes as she finished. Gerald thought carefully before replying. Gwen, I can't imagine how hard this is for you, but it's okay to feel scared, confused, and worried about Sherry's future. There's no easy answer here, and you don't need to make a decision right now. You have your house, your job, and you're doing okay. Give yourself some time to think this through. When you're ready, you'll need to talk to Sherilyn. And when that time comes, I believe you'll know what to do. Gwen sighed. I wanted you to tell me exactly what to do, but I think what you just said is the best advice for me right now. I'm so confused that I might make a rash decision. Thank you, Gerald. You're the best friend a confused woman could have. I'll always be here for you and Sherilyn, Gerald reassured her. Gwen touched his cheek gently. I knew that, but it helps to hear you say it. Her tears had stopped, and she gave a weak smile. Why don't you and Sherilyn go home when you're ready and enjoy a nice evening together? Come over tomorrow for dinner, and we can have a simple, quiet time. That sounds good, Gwen agreed. Give me a few minutes, and I'll take her home. Gerald nodded and went inside, leaving Gwen to gather her thoughts. A short while later, Gwen came in looking calmer. Sherry, sweetheart, are you ready to go? We have school tomorrow, and we're making dinner for Gerald tomorrow night. Okay, Mama. Can we make enchiladas and tacos again? Maybe, or we could make homemade pizzas. We'll decide in the morning and surprise Gerald. I like that idea, Sherilyn said, packing her things. Gerald walked them to their car, said goodnight, and watched them drive away. Back inside, Gerald wished he had a TV to distract him, but instead he picked up a book and read until midnight, finally falling asleep with his mind still buzzing. The next morning, he decided to go into town for breakfast and to pick up some supplies. At a local cafe, as he waited for his meal, he heard a familiar voice. Gerald? Is that you? It was Jim Sanders, who got up and came over to Gerald's table. I wanted to thank you again for dinner last night and for helping Jenny with fractions. She talked about it all the way home. You're welcome, Gerald replied. After a moment, he added, Do you have a minute? Jim checked his watch. Sure, let me grab another cup of coffee. He called the waitress to refill their cups. Once they were alone, Jim asked, What's on your mind? Gerald took a deep breath and said, There's something I need to clear up, and it's a bit awkward. I think there might be rumors about Gwen and me. I want you to know we're just neighbors and friends, nothing more. I care about Sherilyn, and I think she likes spending time with me too, but I don't want Gwen or Sherilyn to face any gossip. Gwen's married, and Sherilyn really misses her dad. I'm only a friend. Jim nodded with understanding. I get it, and I'll do my best to keep things quiet if I hear anything. There's one more thing, Gerald continued, and it's not really my business, but I think it's important. Gwen's husband is in prison, and there may be rumors about that too. I hope people judge Gwen and Sherilyn for who they are, not based on someone they don't even know. Jim looked Gerald in the eye and replied, I appreciate your honesty. You're talking about Pam. She's been curious about what's going on. We talked last night after Jenny went to bed. I reminded her how our father's jobs affected our families growing up. We discussed how this affects families, and I think Jenny learned something important. I won't stop her from spending time with Sherilyn, and I respect Gwen after meeting her. I doubt that eases all your worries, but I hope it helps. Thank you, Jim. You really understand what I'm concerned about, and you've just earned my vote. We need good people like you in office, Gerald said, relieved. Jim smiled. Thanks. I should get going. I have another meeting. They shook hands, and Gerald felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he left. That evening, Gerald went to Gwen's house feeling better. They made taco pizzas, blending Italian and Mexican flavors, and had a great time. When Sherilyn went to her room, Gwen nervously mentioned, Jenny's mom invited us to dinner at their house tomorrow night. I told her I'd check with you first. Gerald replied, I think I'll skip it. It's more important for you and Sherry to build your friendship. You both should get to know them better. Did you talk to Jim? Gwen asked. I had a quick chat with him this morning. He mentioned they talked after he got home last night, Gerald said. Gwen understood his intentions and thanked him. "I just don't want you to feel excluded." "I won't. It's important that Jennifer and Sherry strengthen their bond and that Pam and Jim get to know you better. I'll join next time, I promise." "I'm going to hold you to that," Gwen said with a smile, then called Pam to confirm the dinner. Gerald smiled back, knowing he made the right choice. A week later, Gwen invited the Sanders family to her house for dinner, and Gerald kept his word, bringing fresh Italian bread and the beans Jim had asked for. As soon as he arrived, Jennifer and Sherilyn pulled him into the living room, where beans were already laid out on the coffee table. With a glass of tea beside him, Gerald began a lesson on multiplying fractions using the beans. He guided the girls through the process, letting them figure out that 1/4 of 1/2 equals 1/8. Sherilyn initially said 1/4, but Jennifer corrected her, saying, "No, Sherry, that's 1/4 of 1/2. I think it's 1/8. Gerald smiled quietly, proud of how they were learning together. Sherilyn's face lit up as she exclaimed, "I get it! Each of these is 1/4 of the half, but when we split the other half into pieces, we get 8 piles. So one pile is 1/8 of the whole." Jennifer beamed along with Sherilyn. "You two just won the jackpot and get to keep all the beans," Gerald joked, making them giggle. "For your homework and for the rest of your lives, when you multiply fractions, just write them down. Then multiply the top numbers together and the bottom numbers together." Jennifer asked, "Do we need to make the bottom numbers the same, like when we add or subtract?" "No, that's only for addition and subtraction. When you multiply or divide, you don't worry about that because you're just scaling things by a different number," Gerald explained. He then gave them a few practice problems, making sure one of them had a more challenging numerator. Both girls worked through the problems quickly, occasionally pausing to repeat his instructions. "I don't know why you girls thought you couldn't do this. You both got them all right," Gerald said, using a comedic tone that made them laugh. From behind, Pam commented, "I just learned something I never understood before. I always used a calculator." Gwen added with a grin, "Me too. I think it's because Gerald acts like a 10-year-old. Gerald, feeling a bit embarrassed, turned to see everyone watching him. Gwen then said, "Come on, everyone. It's time to divide our dinner into 6 parts." They all smiled and moved into the dining room. Gwen and Pam brought out a big dish of roast and vegetables, along with a large bowl of Gerald's beans, placing it in front of Jim. "Okay, I've got my share," Jim joked. Pam replied playfully, "Not if you want to sleep in my bed tonight." The adults chuckled while the girls looked puzzled. Dinner went smoothly, with everyone enjoying the meal. Pam praised the potatoes and vegetables, which Gwen proudly shared came from her garden, a garden Gerald and Sherilyn had helped plant. Pam expressed a desire for a similar garden, and before Gerald knew it, he had another project lined up. They planned to start on Tuesday, with the girls helping to plant after school on Wednesday. By the end of the school year, Jennifer and Sherilyn had become close friends. Jim was elected sheriff and began his new role in mid-May. With Gwen's help, Gerald provided 4 types of bread and 10 gallons of his beans for the celebration. Although his garden couldn't produce enough beans, he began making and selling them at the market. Initially slow, sales picked up as people tried and loved his lamb and beans, promoted with the catchphrase, "Good enough to keep the lawman happy." That summer, Gwen taught summer school while Pam kept busy with social events. Jennifer and Sherilyn often spent their days with Gerald, learning everything from weighing and measuring to baking and selling at the market. The girls earned some money for their work, half of which they were allowed to keep, just like Gwen and Jim had done. During their free time, the girls became adept at shopping, comparing prices and product quality, and consulting Gerald when unsure. He even taught them how to research products and ingredients online. As they learned more about natural ingredients, both girls began to prefer a more natural look. Gerald also introduced them to percentages, fractions, and decimals, using beans to explain these concepts. The girls quickly grasped the new ideas, often discussing them together before answering Gerald's questions. They continued the practice of writing about their activities and explaining instructions or recipes, which helped them improve their reading and comprehension skills. Jim and Pam hosted a big 4th of July party, bringing everyone together and sparking discussions about the country's history. As usual, the girls had many questions, often beginning with "why?" Gerald would share stories and then ask them what they would have done in those situations. In late July, Jim, Pam, and Jennifer went on a 2-week vacation and invited Sherilyn to join them. Their trip included stops in Washington, D.C. and other Eastern destinations. Gerald encouraged them to keep a journal and gifted them colorful notebooks and pens to document their experiences. While they were away, Gwen visited the prison and then spent a week with her parents. Although Gerald stayed busy, he missed his friends and eagerly awaited their return. When Gwen got back, he invited her over for dinner, giving them a rare chance to talk alone. Gwen brought up her marriage again, sharing that her husband had mentioned divorce during her visit. He was likely facing another 10 years in prison, and her parents had advised her to prioritize her happiness and Sherilyn's need for closure. Gwen was considering making a decision by the end of the year and asked Gerald if he thought that was a good idea. "Gwen, I believe you'll know when the time is right," Gerald replied. "Whether it's this year or next, you'll feel it. It's important to discuss it with Sherilyn, too, as she may have strong feelings about it." Gwen nodded. "We've talked a little. She still defends her dad, but she doesn't remember much about when he was around. She looks up to Jenny and Jim's relationship, but she also talks about her bond with you in a similar way. I'm not sure how she'll react." "She's growing up quickly," Gerald said. "I think you'll be impressed by how mature she is when the time comes. Trust her. She's more aware than you might think." "Thanks, Gerald. I needed to hear that. I see it too, but as her mom, I sometimes worry I'm overthinking things," Gwen admitted. Gerald smiled. "Have you thought about what you'll do after the divorce, if it happens?" "It's something I think about a lot," Gwen confessed. "I'd love to travel to places I haven't seen before. I envy Sherilyn's trip to the East Coast, but I'd also like to see the West Coast, especially the Northwest. I could move to a big city and earn more from teaching, but it would be more expensive, and I love my students here. The state is adding more rules that take time away from actual teaching. I'm grateful Sherilyn has you to help her with math and other subjects." "Thanks, but I never thought of myself as a teacher," Gerald replied. "But you are," Gwen insisted. "Your patience and the way you show lessons instead of just talking about them, that's what good teaching is all about." "Anyway," Gwen continued, "I've made a decision. I'm going to stay here until Sherilyn finishes high school. I might stay longer, but I won't move her before then. My personal dreams can wait. Right now, it's more important for her to have stability, and I guess I need that too." Gerald, who realized he had been holding his breath, let out a long sigh. "I think that's a good choice." "Me too," Gwen agreed. Then she changed the subject. "I'm thinking about bringing the internet back. It's expensive, but I believe Sherilyn will need it more for school. What do you think?" "I've been thinking about that too," Gerald said. "Sherilyn will definitely need it as she continues school. I have an idea before you spend any money. Our houses are less than 100 yards apart, and my internet can support multiple devices, but the Wi-Fi doesn't reach that far. I think I can run a cable from my house to yours with a signal booster. You could use my internet without paying extra." "Will you get in trouble for doing that?" Gwen asked. "If they ever checked, they might raise an issue, but I doubt they will," Gerald replied. "It's really no different than you using a laptop here. I'd just run a wire along the fence to your house so you don't have to come over all the time." "It sounds so easy, but I love the idea of having access at home too," Gwen said, nodding thoughtfully. "It would let me spend more time at home instead of being at school for grading and emails. Let's give it a try. If it doesn't work, you can still get your own internet service," Gerald suggested. "Can I come with you to get the supplies?" Gwen asked. "Of course. Let's go after breakfast," Gerald replied. "Only if I make breakfast for you," Gwen teased. "Deal," Gerald agreed with a smile. The next morning after breakfast, they drove to a discount computer store about 30 miles away. They found a knowledgeable salesman who suggested a small server instead of a signal booster for a stronger, more reliable connection. As they were checking out, Gerald spotted a red laptop on clearance. "What's the story with that laptop?" he asked the salesman. The salesman explained, "A customer bought it for his son, but it couldn't handle the high-end games the boy played. We took it back because the customer spends a lot with us. It's still a good laptop, though. Great for internet use, videos, writing, and spreadsheets. It just can't run those complicated action games." "For that price, I'll take it," Gerald decided. I've been thinking about upgrading my home computer, and this deal is too good to pass up." As they loaded the laptop into the cart, Gwen joked, "So my house is now a barn?" "Well, I might want to connect something to the barn someday," Gerald replied with a grin, "but your barn is only 50 feet from your house." "Exactly. I need about 100 feet of cable to be safe," Gerald quipped. They both chuckled at their playful banter. Once home, Gerald began running the cable, connecting the new line to the old wiring. While he worked, Gwen got a call and had to go to the school to review her fall schedule. Gerald waved her off and continued working. An hour later, he finished running the cable along the fence to her house. He set up the server and plugged in Gwen's computer. It started right up. He then set up the laptop in Sherilyn's room, typing "Welcome Home" on the screen and leaving a note for Gwen to come over for dinner later. That evening, Gerald fired up the grill, marinated 2 steaks and baked potatoes while Gwen arrived with a salad and a smile. "Thank you so much, Gerald. The computer works great," she said, hugging him warmly. Gerald blushed but said nothing. "By the way," Gwen continued, "Pam called while I was at school. They'll probably be home the day after tomorrow in the afternoon. I told her we'd have dinner when they get back." "Then I need to go to the store and get some beans," Gerald joked. Gwen laughed and handed him 2 bags. "I thought you might need these," she said with a grin. On Friday, Gerald brought a pot of beans and 2 loaves of bread to Gwen's house. "They called. They'll be here in about an hour. Have a seat. I got some drinks for when they arrive," Gwen said, handing Gerald a beverage. An hour later, they heard a car pull up and went outside to greet the visitors. Sherilyn and Jennifer jumped out, chattering excitedly, and hugged Gwen and Gerald tightly. Jim and Pam stepped out next, looking tired from the trip. Gerald handed Jim a cold drink, which he accepted with a grateful nod, while Gwen offered Pam a glass. As the adults exchanged pleasantries, Sherilyn grabbed her bag and dashed inside with Jennifer. Moments later, a loud scream echoed from Sherilyn's room. Gwen looked worried until Sherilyn came running back and hugged her tightly. "Thank you so much, Mom. I love it, and it's red too, my favorite color, and it has internet." She quickly let go and dashed back to her room. Still puzzled, Gwen turned to Jim and asked, "How much time would I get if I, had to take care of a man who really deserved it?" Jim, surprised, replied, "Maybe 5 years? 3 with a good lawyer." Pam joked, "If it was a guy who truly deserved it and the jury was all women, they'd probably let you off and take you to lunch. So who is this guy?" "That guy over there," Gwen said, pointing to Gerald. "He bought Sherilyn a computer without even telling me." Gerald, feeling a mix of embarrassment and annoyance, replied, "Just tell her it's from my royalty check this quarter." Gwen shot him a look and said, "I better see the proof when that check arrives." Gerald handed her the check, and she smiled, saying nothing more. An hour later, they managed to pull the girls away from Sherilyn's computer, where they had set up all the popular social networks. As they sat down for dinner, Jim remarked, "I thought I was fit enough to catch a bad guy, but I'm definitely not fit enough to keep up with these 2. Everyone chuckled, and Pam nodded in agreement. On Saturday, Gerald went to the market alone, as Sherilyn had stayed up late and slept until nearly noon. 2 weeks later, as school started, things settled back into their usual routine. One Sunday, after the last market in October, Gerald was over for dinner, which was running a bit late. After helping Sherilyn with her homework, Gwen suggested he watch the evening news while she finished up. As Gerald watched, he froze when a story about a new factory opening 100 miles away came on. They interviewed the factory manager, and when the segment ended, Gerald stood up, shaken, and walked into the kitchen with tears in his eyes. He apologized, saying he had to leave, and then headed home. An hour later, a worried Gwen knocked on his door, carrying a plate of dinner for him. Though his tears had dried, the sadness was still evident. "Gerald, you've always been here for me. Please talk to me. What happened?" "I'm sorry, Gwen. I just saw something on the news that upset me." "Please tell me," Gwen urged. Gerald, looking deeply saddened, explained. "They showed a story about the new plant. The plant manager was my ex-wife's boyfriend. She was standing next to him. But that's not what hurt the most. I saw my 2 kids standing beside her." Tears began to roll down his face again. Gwen looked at him in shock, realizing that he had never mentioned his children before. It felt like a whole new side of Gerald was being revealed, one she wasn't prepared for. Finally, she said, "You never mentioned them, and I never thought—" Gerald stood up, went to his bedroom, and returned with 2 boxes. He placed them next to Gwen and went to get a drink of water. Gwen opened one box and found school pictures of young children and envelopes marked, "Moved, address unknown." Inside were letters written each week, the most recent dated that very morning. They were unsent, in pristine condition, as if waiting for something to change. When Gerald returned and sat back down, Gwen struggled to find the right words. "Gerald, I'm so sorry you've been through this. I feel like I'm reading a story that isn't mine to read." "No, Gwen, don't feel that way. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't fully understand it myself. I guess today was just the day fate decided I should share this with you. I didn't do it very well." "You did fine," Gwen reassured him. "I can see you're still processing everything. But when you're ready, I'll be here to help you figure things out." "Thanks, Gwen. I really appreciate your support. You don't know how much it means to me," Gerald said, his voice soft. Gwen warmed up his dinner in the microwave. After he sat down to eat, she gave him a hug and quietly left. A week and a half later, Gerald called Gwen and asked her to come over after school. She dropped Sherilyn off at home and walked down to his place, ready to listen and support him through whatever came next. Gwen found Gerald at the kitchen table with 2 envelopes and letters beside them. She sat down, waiting for him to speak. "Gwen, I've been thinking," Gerald began. "I don't know what Rick and Denise have been told about me or why I haven't reached out to them sooner. So I don't think it's a good idea to just show up out of the blue. I decided to write them each another letter and send it to the plant. I hope it helps ease things. What do you think?" Gwen considered his plan, recognizing it as a cautious approach that protected Gerald while still reaching out. "I think it's a smart idea, Gerald. It opens the door without putting too much pressure on you or the kids." "That's what I was thinking, too. I'll mail these in the morning." 2 weeks later, when Gwen and Sherilyn came over for dinner, Gwen noticed the same 2 envelopes on the table, both marked "Return to Sender, no person at this address." She saw the defeated look on Gerald's face. "Gerald, I have an idea. Can I try something to see what's going on?" Gerald, sounding tired, replied, "Sure, I don't have a better plan." After dinner, while Gerald helped Sherilyn with her homework, Gwen stepped outside to make a call. "Jim, it's Gwen. I need a favor. A few weeks ago, there was news about a plant opening a couple of counties away. Do you know anyone there who can help find out about the plant manager? It's personal." Jim responded, "I know the sheriff there. What do you need to know?" Gwen explained briefly. "Gerald thinks he might know the guy they interviewed, but he's not sure. He tried to reach him with a letter but didn't hear back. Can you help? I'll call the sheriff in the morning and let you know what I find out," Jim promised. The next afternoon, Jim arrived at Gwen's driveway while Gerald was inside helping Sherilyn and Jennifer with their homework. Gwen called Gerald outside. Gerald shook hands with Jim and looked at Gwen curiously. "I asked Jim to talk to the sheriff over there," Gwen explained. Jim then shared what he had learned. "This guy came to town with his family, claiming he was scouting locations to build a factory that would create jobs. It got a lot of attention, even from the local news. But when he finally met with the city council, they found out he was just a promoter for a group wanting to build a toxic waste processing plant. They would only hire 20 people and wanted the city to give them free land and no taxes for 20 years. The council said no, and he left town, leaving only a phone number. It turns out he's made the same offer in several towns across different states." Gerald and Gwen exchanged disappointed looks. Jim asked, "Gwen mentioned you might know this guy, Gerald?" "Yeah, he used to be my boss. He has something of mine," Gerald replied quietly. "Is it valuable?" Jim asked. "It means a lot to me," Gerald said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Thanks for looking into this, Jim." He then re-entered the house to join the girls. Jim turned to Gwen, his eyebrow raised. "The woman was Gerald's ex-wife," Gwen explained. "And the kids?" "Thanks, Jim. Both of us appreciate it," Gwen said, leaving it at that. Jim understood and gave her a supportive hug, not pressing further. The rest of the fall passed without major issues. Gerald seemed more energetic, and their quarterly royalty check was the largest yet. They celebrated at a new Mexican restaurant in town with Jim and Jenny, while Pam had a meeting that night. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's were spent as they had in the past, with Jim, Pam, and Jenny becoming more involved in their celebrations. As the new year began, it was peaceful, but cold. Gerald was nearly out of firewood and was chopping more when Gwen and Sherilyn came by, bundled up against the cold. He led them inside, offering hot coffee and quickly making hot chocolate for Sherilyn. As they sat down, Gerald noticed Sherilyn seemed unusually quiet and shy, something he hadn't seen in years. "Let me guess," Gerald said, trying to lighten the mood. "Someone wants something but feels shy about asking." Gwen smiled and encouraged, "Go on, Sherry." "Mom, this is so hard," Sherilyn said, looking nervous. "Honey, there will be many hard things in life. Just take a deep breath and say it. Gerald isn't going to yell at you," Gwen reassured her. Sherilyn took a moment and then spoke. "Gerald, in a couple of weeks the school is having a party and I was wondering if you would go with me." Her face turned red with anxiety. Gerald glanced at Gwen, who was watching Sherilyn. "That was the hard part, Sherry. Now tell him the rest," Gwen encouraged. Sherilyn looked up at her mom, then quickly back at Gerald. "It's a father-daughter Valentine's Day dinner party," she blurted out before looking down at her lap again. Gerald gently lifted her chin so she could see him and said, "Of course, I'd be very happy to go to the Valentine's dinner party with you." A huge smile spread across Sherilyn's face and she hugged him tightly. Thank you, she exclaimed. Gwen beamed at them, and Sherilyn dashed off to send a message to Jenny on the computer. Gerald and Gwen stepped out onto the porch with their coffee cups, settling into their rocking chairs. "What was all that about?" Gerald asked. When the party came up, Sherilyn felt she couldn't go because her dad isn't here. Jenny suggested that you could take her instead. Sherilyn asked me what I thought, and I told her it was a great idea. But then she got shy because it's a Valentine's Day dinner, Gwen explained. "Oh, I see. That's why she was so nervous." "Exactly. She asked me to ask you for her, but I thought it would be better if she did it herself. As you saw, it was like a boy asking a girl out for the first time. She's starting to notice boys a little, and she talks about them a lot with Jenny, but she's embarrassed to talk about it even with me," Gwen added. Gerald smiled. "I guess she's growing up just fine." "I hope so. You've done a wonderful job raising her, Gwen," Gerald said sincerely. "Thanks," Gwen replied, smiling warmly. Just then, Sherilyn came outside and climbed into Gerald's lap. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, wrapping his arms around her to keep her warm. "Jenny and I were talking, and we think you must have a daughter. Do you?" Sherilyn asked, looking up at him with curiosity. Gerald shot a glance at Gwen, who shook her head slightly. "Why do you think that?" he asked. "Because you do all the dad things so well. We think you must have had practice." Gerald sighed softly. "Yes, I do have a daughter and a son. Their names are Denise and Rick." Sherilyn looked puzzled. "You don't talk about them. Do you see them or talk to them?" Gerald spoke gently. "No, Sherry, I don't. I don't know where they are, and as far as I know, they don't know where I am." He felt a lump in his throat. Sherilyn stayed quiet for a moment, deep in thought. After taking a deep breath, she seemed to make a decision. "Gerald, my mom said that my real dad won't be coming home for a long, long time. I don't like not having a dad. So will you be my substitute dad? I would like to be your second dad." Gerald looked at her tenderly. "Don't you think you should talk to your mom first? She might have something to say about that." Sherilyn turned to her mom with a hopeful look. Gwen took a moment, then said, "Sherry, most of us don't get to choose our dad, but I think you've picked a great choice for a second dad, and you'll be very lucky if Gerald agrees." Sherilyn smiled and looked back at Gerald. He smiled warmly and said, "I would be proud to be your dad and even prouder to have you as my daughter." They celebrated their new bond with a warm embrace. Gerald brought out pizza dough and they made homemade pizzas together. They raised glasses to their new relationship, wine for the adults and grape juice for Sherilyn. After dinner, Sherilyn asked, "Daddy, I don't know when your birthday is. A daughter should know her dad's birthday." "All right, but you have to tell me yours too." "My birthday is July 15th, Gerald said. Sherilyn giggled as Gerald looked puzzled. "That's funny. Mine is July 15th, too. I won't forget yours, and Mom won't have to remind me." They shared a warm hug, and Gwen smiled with joy. As the big day approached, Gerald grew more nervous. He hadn't worn a coat and tie in almost 5 years and wasn't sure how the other parents would react. Unsure of what to do, he asked Gwen for help. After explaining his worries, Gwen reassured him, "I can't help you choose your outfit, but some dads will dress up, while others will just wear a shirt. Just be comfortable and don't worry about the other parents. Also, it's tradition for the dad to buy a small Valentine corsage for his daughter, and she will buy you a gift too. Just be yourself." Gerald visited several flower shops looking for corsages, but they all seemed too fancy. Finally, he bought 4 rosebuds and some ribbon to make his own. Gerald spent more time on the corsage than expected, but he was pleased with the result. He placed it in the refrigerator to keep it fresh for the next evening. When the night arrived, he dressed in slacks, a sport coat, and a tie, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. Despite Gwen's reassuring words, his anxiety lingered as he drove to pick up Sherilyn. However, when she walked into the room wearing a pink dress with dark red trim, his worries melted away. Her smile lit up the entire room. "Sherry, you look so lovely tonight," Gerald said warmly. "Thank you, Dad. Mom said you look great tonight, but I think you're really handsome," Sherilyn replied, beaming. "I brought you a corsage, but I might need your mom's help to pin it on. I'm not very good at that kind of thing," he admitted with a smile. Gwen helped with the corsage, and they admired the arrangement. A pink rosebud just starting to open, complemented by a red rosebud and 2 white buds. As they arrived at the event, the announcer called their names, and they walked into the spotlight to light applause. Sherilyn's excitement was contagious, and Gerald couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Soon after, Jenny and Jim entered to even louder cheers, with Jenny glowing as she proudly held her medallion. The evening was filled with laughter, storytelling, and heartfelt moments, emphasizing the strong bonds between parents and their children. Gerald and Gwen exchanged glances, both thankful for the special connections that were being celebrated that night. After dinner, which featured chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables, the girls loudly whispered that Gerald's cooking was better, causing giggles among the other girls. Gerald smiled, feeling a sense of contentment. Later, they mingled in the cafeteria, which was decorated with handmade hearts. Jim introduced Gerald to several fathers, making it clear that Gerald was becoming well known among the parents. As the night continued, fathers and daughters danced together, and later the girls formed groups to dance while the fathers watched with pride. Toward the end of the evening, a younger man approached Gerald and introduced himself as the school principal. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Murphy. Both Jennifer and Sherilyn have been telling everyone how much you've helped them with math and other subjects," the principal said. "I was wondering if you might want to help some of our 3rd and 4th graders who are struggling with math. Testing time is coming up, and they really need support." Gerald was taken aback but replied, "I've only ever taught Jenny and Sherry. I'm not sure my teaching style would work in a school setting. The kids we're talking about have had regular teaching, but they're still struggling. I'm willing to give it a shot, and if even a few of them learn something, it'll be worth it. I can pay you for your time. It's not much, but it's something. You could come in on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday mornings." "Okay, I'll give it a try," Gerald agreed. "Thank you. My wife buys your bread and beans from the market almost every week. If you could work with the kids for a couple of hours in the mornings, that would be perfect." "I'll be there around 9 o'clock, Gerald confirmed. "Great. I'm looking forward to it," the principal said, leaving with a smile. Jim, who had been nearby, smiled at Gerald. "I think you might have gotten yourself into something big without realizing it." Gerald chuckled. "It can't be that bad, can it?" Jim grinned. "Come over for dinner Monday night, and I'll have some drinks ready for you. Bring Sherry and Gwen, too. Gwen might need to drive you home." Gerald smiled back. "All right, but I doubt I'll need those drinks." "We'll see about that," Jim teased. Later, the girls asked if they could stop for ice cream before heading home. Gerald and Jim agreed, and they all enjoyed a chilly treat before returning home. That evening, Gerald shared the day's events with Sherilyn as she got ready for bed. He told Gwen about his new role helping the students and Jim's playful warning. Gwen smiled. "You're going to do great, but Jim's right. These kids might challenge your patience, but I know you can handle it. Let's see how you feel on Monday night." After a warm hug from Sherilyn, Gerald went home, took off his medallion, and hung it up. He then sat down to write letters to his children, sharing his evening and expressing his wish that they could have been with him. He placed the letters in their boxes and went to bed. The next day was busy with baking and preparing for the Saturday market. After school, the girls helped him roll out more buns while they chatted and listened to music. Gwen arrived to pick them up for a sleepover at Jim and Pam's, inviting Gerald to join them for a late dinner. They agreed to meet at 7:30. During dinner, Gwen gave Gerald a list of the students he would be working with, sharing details about each one when Sherilyn wasn't present. She highlighted 3 students in particular. Roberto was smart but influenced by his older brother, who was involved with a local gang. Susie did well in school but often forgot what she learned the next day, confusing everyone. Dwayne was bright and cheerful but focused on becoming a professional athlete, dismissing the importance of school. Gerald listened carefully, asking questions to better understand each student. After returning home, he spent an hour researching how children develop and learn, finding some ideas to consider over the weekend. On Monday, he arrived at the school at 9 o'clock, where the principal welcomed him warmly and showed him to a room next to the library. There was a table with 7 chairs. The principal left to bring in the 3rd graders, including Susie. Gerald had brought some beans and other materials, but decided to first get to know the kids better. He asked them to introduce themselves and share their dreams for the future, taking notes as they spoke. When the bell rang, he stretched and prepared for the 4th graders. He was surprised by the difference between the 2 groups. The 3rd graders openly shared their dreams, both realistic and fantastical, while the 4th graders were more reserved and shared less about themselves. After their introductions, Gerald noticed a few students seemed uninterested. He gathered the ones who had mentioned specific careers and took them to the librarian. "Can you help these 4 find books about jobs?" "Something realistic, not fantasy," Gerald asked the librarian, who nodded with a smile. Turning to the students, he said, "I want each of you to read a book about the careers you mentioned. Then write me a report on what you need to do to get there. Can you do that?" The students agreed, and Gerald watched as the librarian guided them to the career section. He then returned to the classroom where 2 students remained, waiting to see what was next. Dwayne spoke up, "Hey, I thought you were going to make us math wizards." Roberto giggled. Gerald replied, "First, I'm not dude, I'm Gerald. Second, I can't make you a math wizard, only you can do that. I'm just here to help." Dwayne's smile faded as he looked at Gerald, while Roberto continued to laugh. Gerald continued, "You know, you 2 are more alike than you think." Dwayne quickly countered, "No way, I want to be a top football or basketball player. He just wants to be a bad guy. We're nothing alike." Roberto grinned, but Gerald shook his head gently. "Actually, you are alike. Both of you are smart enough to do whatever you want, but you've chosen paths that might not last long. Dwayne, even if you make it to the pros, you might only play for 10 years. Many athletes' careers last only 3 years or less. After that, if you haven't saved your money, you could end up with nothing." Dwayne's serious expression showed that Gerald's words were sinking in. Gerald turned to Roberto. "And you, Roberto, joining a gang doesn't guarantee anything. If Dwayne's career is short, yours could be even shorter. Many gang members face serious consequences before they even turn 21. It's not a good life, especially if you want to have a family someday. You don't have to believe everything I say, but you're smart enough to look up the facts about the path you're considering. Don't just read about the exciting parts. Learn how things really turn out." Just then, Gerald noticed the time and realized class was almost over. "Dwayne, I suggest you ask the librarian for a book called Brian's Song. It's a true story about 2 football teammates and what they went through. One of them is in the Hall of Fame, but what happened to the other? Read the book and see for yourself." Roberto scoffed. "What should I read?" "Roberto, I can't tell you what to do, but I think you should learn about what happens to gang members and really think about it. Tomorrow, we'll start with math." The bell rang and the 2 students left. Gerald packed up his bag and headed toward the office where he met Gwen in the hallway. "Hi, how did it go today?" Gwen asked. "Mostly well," Gerald replied. "I asked the kids to share about themselves and their dreams. I had the fourth graders find books about their career choices to read and write a report on. That's cool, Gwen said. You can't do math if you can't read. What about the 3 I told you about? Susie was quiet, so I couldn't learn much, but I have an idea to try tomorrow. If I can connect with Dwayne, I think I can help him. He needs a reality check. Roberto, well, he's built some strong walls around himself. I've never met someone like him before, so I'll just have to see how it goes. If you need any help, just ask, Gwen offered. My planning time is in the morning, so I can assist if you need it. Thanks, Gerald said with a grin. I'll reach out if I need it. Are you and Sherry in for tacos tonight? Sherry always wants tacos, Gwen smiled. And I might be persuaded if you make some with chicken. I already planned that. Come over when you get home. Later, Gerald checked out at the office, stopped at the store, and then went home to prepare for the taco dinner. After chopping the lettuce, tomatoes, and grating the cheese, he was ready when Gwen and Sherilyn arrived at 7 o'clock. They enjoyed the tacos, and Sherilyn was still excited about the Valentine's party, smiling at Gerald's medallion hanging on the wall. After they left, Gerald sat down and wrote out math problems for the students to work on the next day, tailoring some specifically for Dwayne and Roberto. The following morning, he pulled Susie aside and asked her to write down all the steps for each math problem they tackled. She smiled and agreed. As they worked, the students began chatting and helping each other with their answers. When they finished, Gerald reviewed their work. Most of them had done well with only a few mistakes. The fourth graders arrived, and they followed the same routine. Roberto looked bored while Dwayne watched silently. When Gerald handed out the worksheets, he asked Roberto and Dwayne to work together. They both stared at their papers in surprise. As the other kids started working, Dwayne began to speak, but Gerald signaled for them to join him at a small table on the side. Once seated, Dwayne said, "These problems are different from what the others have. What's going on?" Gerald replied, "You both have big dreams and don't want to worry about what the other kids are doing. These problems use the same math, but they relate to things you need to think about. You both have the ability to solve them. Just give it a try." The 2 problems were designed to be more challenging. The first problem was about a $150,000 contract, requiring them to calculate what would be left after paying an agent, a manager, and taxes. The second involved an order of 100 computers, with some arriving damaged or missing, asking them to determine how much of the shipment was still sellable and calculate the financial loss. While the other kids worked on simpler problems, Gerald watched to see how Dwayne and Roberto would handle theirs. When the bell rang, the other students turned in their papers, having done well. Dwayne and Roberto were still working, but they weren't collaborating. They handed their papers to Gerald, who told them to finish at home and bring them back the next day. On Wednesday, Gerald had the third graders work on a similar set of problems before starting the lesson. When he reviewed Susie's paper, he noticed that almost all her answers were incorrect, despite getting everything right the previous day. He introduced a new lesson and distributed worksheets, then asked the librarian to bring the principal and Gwen to the library. When they arrived, Gerald showed them Susie's 2 papers. "This is the paper Susie did yesterday where she got everything correct. Today, she seems to have forgotten it all." They nodded in agreement. Gerald then asked Susie to bring her notebook and try the same problems again, using the notes she had taken the day before. This time, she got all but 1 correct. Gerald smiled and sent her back to the other students. Gwen asked, "What do you mean, Gerald?" "When I was in high school, there was a girl who had a similar issue. They found nothing wrong, but one teacher noticed that if she took notes during lessons and reviewed them, she retained the information better. I think Susie's brain might be taking longer to move information from short-term to long-term memory. If she can use notes to reinforce her learning, it might help." The principal, deep in thought, said, "We have tests coming soon, and she can't use notes during those, but we can let her use them until then. Do you think that will help?" "I'm not sure," Gerald admitted, "but it's worth a try. If you have a practice test from before the Christmas break, see if she can take it again now. She might do better this time." "It's worth trying," the principal agreed. "I'll set it up for tomorrow morning and have the district psychologist visit and talk with her teachers. You may have discovered something important here." The principal then asked, "What's going on with Jimmy Thompson?" Gwen responded, "Jimmy has always been quiet and usually did well in school, but his grades started dropping after Christmas. He hasn't said much, but I worry there might be trouble at home. Kids often keep personal issues to themselves, which can impact their schoolwork. Gerald added, "Can your nurse check his eyes? He seems to understand what we're doing, but I've noticed he either brings the paper very close to his face or bends down to see it." The principal nodded. "I'll have the nurse take a look." Gerald noticed that Jimmy might be having trouble seeing what was on the paper. Gwen mentioned that Jimmy's teacher, Miss Graves, insists that students sit up straight while they work. The principal took Jimmy to the nurse for a checkup. Gwen turned to Gerald, saying, "If you're right, we might all feel a bit foolish." Gerald replied with a smile, "Not at all. You're focused on many kids each day, so it's easy to miss these things. I'm only looking at 6 kids with fresh eyes, so it's easier for me to notice." Gwen, appreciating his perspective, invited Gerald to dinner, hinting that Sherilyn wanted to surprise him with a meal. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Gerald responded. Later, in the 4th grade class, Dwayne called Gerald over. "Why did you give us such a tough problem?" he asked. Gerald explained, "It's the same math, just with bigger numbers. But here's the bigger lesson. Athletes might get huge contracts, but they don't keep all that money. A lot goes to agents, managers, and taxes, so when you turn pro, keep that in mind." Roberto chimed in, "I won't be paying taxes with what I do." Gerald responded seriously, "Even if you don't get caught for what you do, not paying taxes has consequences. Al Capone, one of the most notorious criminals in American history, went to prison for tax evasion, not for his other crimes." Gerald paused, letting the information sink in before adding, "Dwayne, being a great athlete requires teamwork. Roberto, you've got the smarts to be part of a team, but you need to realize that alone, neither of you will reach your goals. I paired you two up to see if you could work together. You chose not to, and that made the problems harder. Learn to cooperate, and you'll find things easier." That evening, Sherilyn greeted Gerald with excitement as she busily prepared dinner. Gwen joined them, sharing the news about Jimmy. "The nurse found a minor vision issue, and he's been sent to an eye doctor. His mother didn't know because they had a car accident over the holidays and couldn't take him for a checkup. Miss Graves was shocked when she found out." Gerald nodded, glad it had been caught in time. Gwen continued, "Susie's teacher is also on board with trying the notebook method to help her retain what she learns. She'll keep an eye on Susie's progress." Sherilyn then announced that dinner was ready, serving a grilled sandwich with cheese, deli meat, and vegetables, accompanied by flavored rice with beans and a small salad. Gerald was pleasantly surprised by the meal, especially enjoying the rice and beans. As they ate, Sherilyn mentioned that she and Jenny were starting geometry and needed help. Gerald offered to host them on Thursday for homemade pizza and a geometry lesson. When the girls arrived after school on Thursday, Gerald suggested they start their geometry lesson in the garden. He asked them to estimate the length of a row of lettuce. Jenny guessed 20 feet. Gerald nodded. "That's a good guess, but how can you be sure?" Sherilyn responded, "If you had a tape measure, you could measure it." Gerald smiled. "Good idea." "Is there another way?" Jenny asked. "Sure," Gerald said, encouraging them. "We planted the lettuce seeds 1 foot apart so we could count the plants to figure out the row's length." "Great idea," Gerald praised. "There are many ways to measure, and that's what geometry is about. Geo means earth, and metric means to measure, so geometry is literally about measuring the earth. Sometimes it's simple, like using a tape measure, but other times, like estimating the height of that tree, it's trickier." The girls looked puzzled. "With geometry," Gerald continued, "you can figure out the tree's height without ever climbing it. That's the beauty of it. It's practical in so many ways. Let's go inside and see where you're starting in your lessons." After a brief introduction and 30 minutes of drawing and discussion, both girls quickly grasped the lesson and finished their homework. They eagerly asked Gerald if they could make the pizzas, and he happily agreed. As they worked, an idea came to him. "Jenny," he asked, "how many spoons of sauce do you think we need for each pizza?" Jenny looked puzzled. "How many slices of cheese do we need?" he continued. Neither girl knew, so Gerald cut the pizza crusts into sections and had them apply sauce and cheese in just 1 section each. "Jenny, how many spoons of sauce did you use for 1 section?" 3. "And Sherry, how many slices of cheese?" "About 4.5. "So, How much would you need for the whole pizza? 18 spoons of sauce, Jenny said. 27 slices of cheese, Sherilyn added. Exactly. If you owned a pizza shop and needed to make 50 pizzas tonight, you'd know just how much sauce and cheese to prepare. This is called surface area, and it's a fundamental part of geometry. It's used in businesses every day, whether people realize it or not. From that day on, Gerald seized every opportunity to teach the girls more about geometry in practical ways. By the time they reached high school geometry, they grasped the material easily, while their classmates struggled. That Friday, Gerald joined Gwen and Sherilyn for dinner. During the meal, Sherilyn asked, "Gerald, how did you get so smart?" Gwen quickly interjected, "Sweetheart, that might make him uncomfortable." "It's okay," Gerald reassured her. "I don't mind sharing." He looked at Sherilyn thoughtfully. "I did well in school, but I wasn't the best at everything. In college, I started studying one subject, but I got interested in something else and ended up studying 4 different subjects before I graduated. I realized I'm what they call a generalist. I love learning about many different things." "What's a major?" Sherilyn asked. Gwen explained. "In college, a major is the main subject you study deeply. You might also choose a minor, which is a secondary subject." Gerald added, "These subjects often align with your future job. For example, doctors typically major in biology. Your mom likely majored in education." "Actually," Gwen said, "I focused on elementary education. I originally wanted to be a science teacher but discovered I loved teaching reading." "So she didn't change her major," Gerald noted. "She just shifted her focus. I, on the other hand, switched majors completely, engineering to history, then political science, and finally graduating with a major in English and a minor in history." "Wow, that's impressive," Sherilyn said, her eyes wide. "Honestly," Gerald said, smiling, "I learned the same way you are now, by being curious and open to different things. I took different classes. Some I liked more than others. As I got older, I realized I enjoyed bits of everything but didn't want to focus on just one subject," Gerald explained. "Is it easy for you to find a job?" Sherry asked. "Not really," Gerald replied. "There was a time when people with a wide range of skills were in demand, but now businesses prefer specialists, people who focus on just 1 or 2 areas." "But you're good at so many things," Sherry said, sounding impressed. "Thank you, dear. There are still places for people like me," Gerald said with a smile. "But what matters most is that I'm content with what I do. That's something important for you to remember, too. When you go to college, you might pick a subject that really interests you, or you might discover something new that captures your attention. There are so many paths out there you haven't even thought about yet. Keep exploring what you enjoy and stay open to surprises." As Gerald spoke, Gwen listened intently, realizing he was explaining things to Sherilyn that she'd been trying to convey for months. It also gave her a deeper understanding of Gerald's perspective. After dinner, Sherilyn went to finish her homework while Gwen and Gerald took their coffee to the porch. "Thank you, Gerald. I've been trying to talk to her about these things, but I wasn't sure if it was sinking in," Gwen said. Gerald smiled. "I just caught a lucky moment. Teachers call it a teachable moment when something important comes up, and you have to share what you can right then. In a few days, this conversation might not matter as much, but tonight it did." "You really are clever," Gwen said, looking at him thoughtfully. "People have called me smart all my life, but I never thought much of it," Gerald replied. "I've always been around people who seem to know more or learn faster. My curiosity about the world shaped who I am. I stopped comparing myself to others a long time ago. I just do my best and see what happens." "Well, I think you're very smart, and I admire that about you," Gwen said, pausing before continuing. "I've decided to visit the prison again to talk to him one more time. If he hasn't changed his mind, I'll likely file for divorce this summer. I don't want to deal with it while school is in session." "You've been patient, Gwen, and I know you've thought a lot about this. If it's the right time, you'll feel it. Just know that I'm here for you." "I wasn't asking for your permission," Gwen said with a small smile. "I just wanted to share what I've decided. After I visit the prison, I'll talk to Sherry. I'm not sure how she'll react." "She might be confused, but you'll find a way to work through it together," Gerald reassured her. "Thanks. That's what I needed to hear," Gwen said, relieved. Later that evening, Sherilyn asked Gerald, What do you think about Mom and Dad splitting up? Gerald thought for a moment. I think your mom is trying to make the best choice for both of you. If I were you, I'd talk to her about how you feel. This is a big change, and it's important for both of you to understand each other. Will you still be there for us? Sherilyn asked, her voice small. Of course I will, Gerald said, his tone firm. Sherilyn smiled, knowing she could count on him. As they prepared for dinner, Gerald noticed Gwen arriving earlier than expected. Sensing something was wrong, he walked over and asked softly, "Do you want to talk?" "Not right now," Gwen replied quietly. "Maybe later." They joined Sherilyn inside, who greeted Gwen with a hug and a glass of tea. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Sherilyn asked, "Mom, are you and Dad going to split up?" Gwen was surprised and glanced at Gerald, who remained silent. "I talked to him, and he said I should ask you," Sherilyn continued. "I know you've been thinking about it. So, what did Dad say?" Gwen felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. "He was pretty straightforward," she began, knowing that this conversation was just the beginning of a longer journey they'd all need to navigate together. Gwen shared the difficult news. "He told me to end it and said I shouldn't visit him anymore. He mentioned he might consider seeing you again after he gets out, if he gets out. He's in more trouble now and has lost most of his good behavior time." Sherilyn felt a tear in her eye, but kept her voice steady. "I kind of saw that coming. I told Gerald, and I'll tell you now, I think this is for the best. I have you and Gerald, and I'm content. When he gets out, I'll be grown, and I'll decide what to do then. For now, I think we should do what he wants. It'll make you happier, and that'll make me happy too." Gwen, surprised by her daughter's maturity, asked, "When did you grow up so much?" Sherilyn replied, "Gerald says we're always growing and learning new things. Sometimes we have to go through tough times to get what we need." She paused, then added, "Gerald, isn't it time to start cooking the chicken?" Gerald smiled and headed outside to put the chicken on the grill. When he returned, he found Sherilyn and Gwen embracing. Gerald set the table and checked on the rolls and vegetables before turning the chicken again. When he came back inside, Sherilyn ran up to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "I love you, Daddy." Touched, Gerald felt a tear in his eye. Gwen hugged him too and said, "I'm not sure what happened, but this has been wonderful. Thank you for being yourself." The warmth of the moment almost caused the rolls and chicken to burn, but they saved the meal just in time. Gerald opened a bottle of white grape juice and poured glasses for everyone. Sherilyn tasted it and smiled, saying, "It tastes like apples." After dinner, Gwen spoke up again. "I've made another decision. I want to do this after school ends. I don't want to teach summer school this year. Instead, I'd like to help you and Sherry with gardening, baking, and the market." "Why even ask? Of course you can," Gerald replied enthusiastically. "I'm not tired at all, Mom," Sherilyn added. "I love working with you. Why don't you come to the market with us tomorrow? It'll be fun." Gwen hesitated. "I don't know what I'd do there." "You just talk to people," Sherilyn encouraged. "If they ask something you don't know, just ask Gerald." Gwen turned to Gerald. "Is that okay with you?" "We leave at 8, so don't be late or you'll miss the train," he said with a grin. Sherilyn chimed in. "Mom, you could make your pralines and sell them. No one there is selling those." Gerald pretended to be shocked. "Gwen Lambert, we've been friends for 4 years, and this is the first time I'm hearing you make pralines. I can't believe it. If I'd known, I would have asked for them at breakfast." He smiled, and Sherilyn giggled as Gwen blushed. "I've only made them for special occasions," Gwen admitted. "But pecans are expensive right now. I'm not sure it's worth it." "Sherry," Gerald said with a knowing look, "this is what adults mean when they talk about not making decisions. They're scared to take a risk, so they come up with all sorts of reasons not to act." Gwen, slightly annoyed but amused, said, "All right, very clever. I'll make a batch when we get home tomorrow, and you can be the judge if they're worth selling." Feeling encouraged, Gwen smiled, though still uncertain. "I do think my cookies are better than the store-bought ones." Gerald added, "I happen to know someone with 3 big pecan trees. They grow local pecans that are smaller but tastier than the store-bought ones. He can't sell them, but he'd be happy to give them away." He handed Gwen a bag of pecans. Sherilyn laughed. "Now you have no excuse, right, Mom?" Gwen smiled back. Okay, clever girl, but you'll have to crack and shell them. They all laughed together, and Sherilyn asked Gerald, "Do you have a nutcracker?" Gerald handed one to her, and she got busy cracking pecans while Gerald and Gwen moved to the porch with their coffee. "Gwen, when I first took my bread to the market, I was nervous and had never done anything like that before. But it turned out fine," Gerald reassured her. "If you don't try, you'll never know if it could work. Give it a shot, and you'll see if people like them. If they do, you'll know what to do. Make more. If not, you can stop." Gwen nodded, feeling a bit more confident. "You're right, Gerald. I'll give it a try. Let's see how it goes. Tomorrow, you can prepare a batch of pralines and keep track of the time it takes and the cost of ingredients," Gerald suggested. "I'll help you figure out the costs, and then we can set a price. Just try it once or twice. You have nothing to lose." Gwen hesitated, but then smiled. "Okay, if you'll help me. You're always encouraging your students to do their best and learn. Now you're doing the same for me." Gerald nodded. "When we're at the market tomorrow, take some time to walk around and observe what others are selling, their prices, and how well they're doing. Some people do really well, others not so much. Keep an open mind. You'll learn something valuable, I promise." "Gerald, you're the most encouraging person I've ever met. I'll give it a try," Gwen said, feeling more confident. Just then, Sherilyn called from the door. "I'm done." "Did you get rid of the shells?" Gerald asked. "No, I know you want to put them in the compost bin," she replied. "That's right," Gerald said with a grin, turning to Gwen. "I like to recycle when I can." The next morning, after setting up for breakfast, Gwen wandered around the market, as Gerald suggested. She saw a variety of items being sold: fruits, vegetables, soap, cookies, cakes. Some booths were busy with customers, while others were quieter. She noticed that a woman selling soap was doing surprisingly well, while another selling fudge had a steady stream of customers. On the other hand, booths with jewelry and handmade items had lots of onlookers but few buyers. Gwen observed all this but wasn't sure what to make of it. When she returned to Gerald's table, she found him selling his last loaf of bread with only 2 jars of beans left. As she approached, Sherilyn pointed out an elderly woman with a cane and a shopping cart slowly making her way toward them. "Hi, Maxine. How are you today?" Gerald greeted her warmly. "I'm doing pretty well, Gerald. Do you have anything left for me?" the woman asked. "I've got 2 jars of beans and some buns that didn't sell. You can have them for $3, Gerald offered. "That sounds great." "Thank you, Gerald. We really enjoy your food. It helps us a lot to get your leftovers," Maxine replied. "Maxine, you know I'll always look out for you," Gerald said. "I know, Gerald. It's tough to get by, but people like you make it easier for us. Go see George. I think he has some lettuce and carrots today that nobody wanted," she said, handing Gerald 3 wrinkled dollars before heading to another stand. As Gerald and Sherilyn packed up their table, Gwen walked over. "Are you ready for lunch? Sherry wants Mexican food. What do you think?" "That girl is going to turn into a taco," Gwen joked. "Mexican sounds good. How did it go today?" "I sold everything. I could have sold 5 more loaves if I had them. I promised some people I'd save special items for them next week," Gerald replied. "But I heard you tell that last woman, Maxine, that the buns you sold her were ones no one wanted," Gwen noted. "Mom," Sherilyn chimed in, "Gerald makes bread just for her and keeps it aside until she comes. He always tells her no one wanted it today. He does the same with the jars of beans. He could just give them to her, but she insists on paying. George does the same with his vegetables. Many people here do that." Gerald shrugged modestly. "It's one of the things that makes this market special. I bake about 20 loaves of bread each week, but bring 25. Some folks can't afford to buy anything here, so a few of us try to make sure they get something. Maxine is one of those people." Gwen nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed some vendors didn't sell much." "Those vendors usually try to sell everything at full price," Gerald explained. "Most regular buyers know who helps others and prefer to buy from them. The others rely on new visitors. They do okay or they wouldn't keep coming back. It's like an unspoken rule. We look out for each other and those in need." "So if I sold pralines, I could give some away or lower the price for certain people?" Gwen asked. "That's entirely up to you," Gerald said. "Mom, when Maxine first started coming, Gerald would give me a pen and tell me to mark the label. That way he could say a kid messed up a jar of beans or a loaf of bread. Now, he just tells her he didn't sell everything. I think she knows, but she plays along, and they both do their part. It's sweet, really, Sherilyn added. Gwen smiled, understanding the market's subtle kindness. So you really sell things, but you also share to help others. That's one way to look at it, Gerald said with a shrug. I don't think about it much. I just do what feels right. You're just like Gerald, Sherilyn laughed as they parked at the Mexican restaurant. Before they ordered, Gwen said, I'm glad you told me to look around and see what was happening at the market. I enjoyed that. I still have many questions, but now I'm excited to see how the pralines will be received. Good choice, Gerald replied simply. After lunch, they went to the store, and Gwen bought the ingredients to make the pralines. Gerald drove them home and then went back to his place for a nap. He was jolted awake by Sherilyn jumping on his bed. Wake up. Mom has a surprise for you. If you jump one more time, I might surprise you right back, Gerald teased. From the living room, they heard Gwen's voice. Sherry, leave him be. He'll get up when he's ready. He's ready, Mom. He just doesn't know it yet, Sherilyn giggled, darting out of the room as Gerald tried to grab her. Gerald grumbled playfully as he crawled out of bed and made his way to the living room. Have you ever thought about giving her back to the Indians? He joked. Gwen laughed. Yes, but they wanted too much to take her back. Take your time waking up. I'll keep her busy. Gerald glanced at the clock. Almost 5 o'clock? Wow, I slept too long. He drank some water and asked, So what's the surprise? Sherilyn shouted, Mom has a praline for you to try. Now that's a great reason to wake me up, Gerald said, rubbing his eyes. Gwen presented a plate of pralines, and Gerald took a bite, savoring the flavor before finishing the rest. Sherilyn could hardly wait. So, what do you think? Gerald closed his eyes and teased, No, we won't sell them. I want them all for myself. Then he smiled at Gwen. These are amazing. We should take them to the market next week. Are you sure? I just made these, Gwen said, still uncertain. I'm sure. Let's make 50 of them. If there are any leftovers, I'll buy them myself. Gwen hesitated, but then agreed. Okay, if you say so. I'll make them on Thursday night. You won't regret it, Gerald assured her. Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. Will you be there? I never miss a chance to enjoy your cooking, but take your little helper with you. I need some time to myself first. Come on, little helper, Gwen said, guiding Sherilyn out of the room. Sherilyn followed her mother, grinning widely. On Sunday, they sat down with Gwen's recipe to calculate the cost of each ingredient. Gerald also factored in the time it took to make the pralines. When they finished, Gwen was surprised to find that for a batch of 50, the cost was just over $1 each. Gerald suggested selling them for $3 each or two for $5. Gwen thought it might be too high, but Gerald reassured her it was a good starting point and they could adjust later if needed. She decided to trust his advice. On Thursday, she and Sherilyn made the candy. On Friday, they packaged the pralines in plastic bags with labels that Gerald had designed and tied ribbons around them for a nice touch. Gwen also had some broken pieces, which Gerald suggested bringing to the market as samples. On Saturday, Gwen stood nervously behind the table with Gerald and Sherilyn, waiting for their first customer. The first to arrive was one of Gwen's colleagues from school. Hi, Gwen. Sherilyn, I haven't seen you here before, her co-worker said. Hi, Linda. This is my first day, Gwen replied, trying to sound confident. So what do you have? Linda asked, noticing the pralines. Oh, pralines. I love pralines. Here, try a piece and see if you like it. It's my grandmother's recipe, Gwen offered. Linda took a bite and her eyes lit up. This is amazing. How much are they? Gwen took a deep breath and replied, They're $3 each or two for $5. Without hesitation, Linda said, I'll take 4, handing over a $10 bill. You're going to do great with these, girl. See you on Monday. Gwen's hand trembled a little as she put the money in the envelope Gerald had given her. When she looked up, she saw Gerald and Sherilyn smiling at her. Sherilyn hugged her, and Gerald shook her hand, congratulating her on her first sale. By the time Gerald sold his last loaf of bread, Gwen had sold her last bag of candy. She was amazed at how much people loved her pralines. Just then, Sherilyn said, Here she comes. Gerald took a loaf of bread and a large jar of beans from the counter and placed them on the table. Good day to you, Maxine, he greeted the elderly woman warmly. "Hello, Gerald. Hello, Sherilyn. How did the market go today?" Maxine asked. "It went really well." "We nearly sold everything, but I still have a few items left for you," Gerald replied, handing her the bread and beans. "Thank you, Gerald. I can't tell you how much I value all that you do for us," Maxine said gratefully. "It's always my pleasure, Maxine," Gerald said with a smile, as Gwen watched with a deep sense of contentment. "Today I have something special for you," Gerald said as Maxine approached. "This is Sherilyn's mom, Gwen. She made some pralines to share, and I think she has just one left." Gwen, a bit shy, smiled when she saw the praline next to Sherilyn. Offering the bag to Maxine, she said, "It's nice to meet you, Maxine. Sherilyn talks about you a lot. Please try my praline and let me know what you think." Maxine hesitated. "I'd love to, but I'm trying to watch my sugar intake." Gerald quickly broke the praline into smaller pieces. "How about this? A small bite every other day won't hurt, and you can share it with your husband." Maxine chuckled. "That sounds perfect, as long as I can keep it away from him." She took the praline and placed it in her basket. Gwen suggested, "Try hiding it in the dish cabinet instead of the pantry. That's how I keep them away from Sherilyn." Maxine grinned. "That's a clever idea. I'll give it a try. Thanks, Gwen. And I'll definitely let you know how I like it." After Maxine left, Gwen turned to Gerald, puzzled. "I meant to save a couple of bags like you told me, but I forgot. Where did that one come from?" Gerald smiled. "Your daughter has become quite resourceful." Sherilyn beamed, and Gwen hugged her tightly. As they packed up, Gerald suggested, "How about a Chinese buffet for lunch?" Sherilyn made a face but didn't complain. Gwen, delighted, said, "Only if I get to pay." "Deal," Gerald agreed. On the drive, Sherilyn was unusually quiet. Gwen asked, "What's wrong, honey? Don't you like Chinese food?" "It's too hot and spicy," Sherilyn replied. Gerald explained, "She hasn't found anything she likes yet, but today I want you to try the orange or sesame chicken without any sauce. I think you might like it." Sherilyn hesitated but agreed. "I'll try, but if I don't like it, I don't want to come back." "Fair enough," Gerald said. At the restaurant, Gerald guided Sherilyn to the trays with the chicken dishes. "These are like chicken nuggets with sauce. Try a little of each and see how you feel." Sherilyn cautiously took a bite and her face lit up. "Hey, this is good. It's not too hot." Gwen and Gerald smiled, pleased with her reaction. Sherilyn even went back for more chicken twice. When they got home, Gwen and Gerald sat down to count their earnings. Gerald had made just over $200, and Gwen was thrilled to see she had earned $130 from her pralines. "I've been thinking about what Maxine said," Gwen mused. "Next week, I'm going to make bigger pralines, but also smaller ones in bags of 6 or 8. I think parents and older folks might prefer smaller pieces. What do you think?" Gerald grinned. "You've really got the hang of this. I suggest making 50 big ones and starting with 25 bags of small pieces. You're definitely gaining more customers." Gwen smiled back. "I was also thinking of giving them a name, like you do with your bread. What about Grandma's Best?" Gerald nodded approvingly. "That's perfect." The next Saturday, Gwen introduced Grandma's Best pralines and Grandma's praline bits. She sold every single one. Later, as they counted the money, Gwen was surprised to find she had made $25 more than the previous week, even with the extra small bags. Curious, she asked Gerald about it. He explained, "Most people bought 2 pralines last week, so you were effectively selling them for $2.50 each. This week, you sold the big ones for $3 and the small ones for $2.50. You actually increased your sales by offering more options. Well done, Gwen. Sell your pralines for $2.75 each, but don't stress over it. Make what you think will sell that week and be satisfied with your results," Gerald advised Gwen. "I'm thrilled with how things are going, but I want to understand why," Gwen replied. "Start a chart," Gerald suggested. "Track how many big and small bags you sell each week and how much money you make. This will help you see patterns and adjust your production accordingly. If you sold 50 big bags and could have sold more small ones, try adding 10 or 15 more small bags next week. Ideally, you want to sell your last bag in the final hour, no leftovers. But don't go overboard. Adjust based on the weather and other factors." "That makes sense," Gwen nodded. "I'll add 10 more items next week." As spring progressed, Gwen consistently earned about $150 each week, bringing in an additional $400 a month after costs. She saved half of her earnings and finally felt less stressed about paying bills. At the end of May, Gwen called Gerald, inviting him over for dinner without explaining why. After a meal with Sherilyn and Jenny, Gwen poured Gerald a glass of juice. "We're celebrating tonight, but I couldn't tell you until after Sherry left," Gwen said. "What are we celebrating?" Gerald asked. "We got the test scores back. Almost all the students you helped passed, and Dwayne and Roberto did really well in math." Gerald smiled. "I'm surprised Roberto passed. I didn't think he got what we talked about. His brother got caught in a raid, and their family moved away soon after, possibly back across the border," Gwen explained. "Susie missed passing by just 1 point, but this was her best score ever. The psychologist diagnosed her with a learning disability, so she'll get extra support for her retake next week." "That's great news," Gerald said. "I'm proud of her." "We're celebrating because of you, Gerald. You made a big difference for these kids. The principal wants to know if you can come in 2 mornings a week next year to help the kids earlier." "Tell the principal I'd be happy to. I enjoyed working with them," Gerald agreed. "You should consider teaching. You'd be great," Gwen encouraged. "I might do well in the classroom, but I'd struggle with all the other stuff," Gerald replied. "Then they'd have to let all of us go," Gwen teased. The 3 of them, often joined by Jennifer, spent the summer working in the garden, baking bread and candy, and selling their goods at the market every Saturday. After school ended, Gwen met with a lawyer who assured her that the divorce would be simple, affordable, and finalized by early August. This lifted a weight off Gwen's shoulders. Jim and Pam had a busy summer, so the Sanders family didn't plan a vacation. But in late June, Gerald suggested renting an RV and taking the girls to the coast for a week. Gwen quickly agreed, and they planned the trip for the week before school started. The girls were thrilled, and Jim and Pam supported the idea. The vacation flew by, leaving the girls tired but happy, and Gerald and Gwen feeling refreshed after their first vacation in over 5 years. The following year passed smoothly, with Gerald helping the girls with their algebra studies, marking a return to normalcy after the challenges of previous years. Gerald's guidance had helped the girls excel throughout the year. In early summer, a company offered to buy the rights to his bean recipe. Gerald struck a deal similar to his bread arrangement. He received a lump sum for the name, but retained the right to sell beans under a new name. Thus, Lemon Beans became Gerald's Beans. He rented an RV, and the family took a westward trip, exploring mountains, deserts, and the Old West over 8 days and 7 states. They continued to document their travels, adding entries to their journal. Sherilyn and Gwen gifted Gerald a small TV, which he seldom used. In return, Gerald bought them a new washer and dryer, much to Gwen's delight. They rang in the new year with Jim, Pam, and Jennifer, grateful for their good fortune. The following years flew by with few major events, but the girls transitioned from elementary and middle school to junior high and high school. Both joined the volleyball and softball teams. Jennifer, now nearly 5'7", thrived as a leader on the volleyball team and excelled at first base in softball. Sherilyn, at 5'4", used her agility to shine in both sports. Despite Jim's work commitments, he, Pam, Gwen, and Gerald attended most games, often celebrating with pizza or burgers. Sherilyn's transformation into a young woman was evident at the Valentine's Day father-daughter dinner. Gerald was moved by how much she had grown, and Sherilyn's warm smile reassured him. Gwen captured the moment with photos, and Gerald treasured a new clay medallion Sherilyn had made for him, though he still held dear the first one she had given him. One day, Gerald was struck by Jennifer's transformation into a lovely young woman. Jim humorously suggested he might need a shotgun, to which Gerald replied he might take him up on it. Dinner that night was the best they'd had in years. While the girls danced, Gerald and Jim discussed summer plans. Jim and Pam were considering a cruise or a Cancun trip and wondered if Sherilyn would be interested. Gerald thought she would love it, and although Gwen might worry about the cost, he believed they could manage it within their budget. Gerald and Gwen relaxed on the porch with coffee. Gerald expressed his struggle with Sherilyn growing up, noting how much she resembled Gwen. Gwen reassured him that growing up was a natural part of life. They discussed Jennifer's maturity and how Sherilyn might soon be as tall as Gwen. Gwen advised Gerald to treat the girls according to their moods, more like kids when they acted young and like adults when they showed maturity. Gerald agreed and realized he needed to adapt his communication style. During Sherilyn's final softball game, she scored a run but was injured when the opposing team's shortstop made a dramatic play. The crowd gasped as Carolyn was hurt. Gwen and Gerald were shocked, and Jim went to fetch his van. The trainer attended to Carolyn's leg, and Gerald carried her to the van for a quick drive to the nearby hospital. In the waiting room, Gwen broke down, and Gerald comforted her. He gave Jim the keys to his truck to pick up Pam and Ginny from school. After a long wait, the doctor finally updated them. Sherilyn had a fractured bone just above her ankle and a tendon injury. The good news was that she'd recover fully, with a cast for 6 to 8 weeks and a brace afterward. She'd be back to normal activities by October. The doctor directed them to Sherilyn's treatment room, and they prepared to see her. The doctor finished applying Sherilyn's cast and handed Gwen a prescription for pain relief. Gwen and Gerald had missed the play's outcome but decided to check on Sherilyn. They found her in the room, groggy but chatting about the game. She couldn't recall the details and asked if they had won. Gerald reassured her she had played well and scored, though they didn't yet know the final result. Sherilyn asked to stay with Gerald, who agreed, despite her pain. The technician admired Sherilyn's bravery and signed the cast before leaving. Sherilyn requested a pizza with all her favorite toppings, and Gerald promised to make it for her. Jim and Jennifer arrived with news that Sherilyn's run was the winning score. Sherilyn was pleased but sleepy. The doctor confirmed the cast was secure enough for her to go home. Gerald drove them back, carefully settling Sherilyn into bed and preparing pizza. At home, Gerald made sure to bake a third pizza when Gwen said Sherilyn was waking up and hungry. They all enjoyed the meal together, with Sherilyn thanking Gerald and asking him to check on her in the morning. Gerald promised he would, and they wished her good night before cleaning up. Gwen expressed her gratitude to Gerald for his support through the day. Gerald assured Gwen he wouldn't want to be anywhere else, and she appreciated his support. Over the next 2 days, Gerald took Sherilyn home, settled her comfortably on his sofa with her leg elevated, and brought her dough to roll. Despite her independence, she appreciated his care. Pam dropped off Jenny with her schoolwork, and the two girls enjoyed their time together. At 5 o'clock, Gerald asked for dinner preferences, and the girls chose tacos. Gwen arrived from her meeting, happy to smell the cooking and see Sherilyn feeling better. The girls teased Gerald as they ate, while Gwen and Gerald had their meal at the table. Jim arrived later to check on Sherilyn and take Jenny home, noting she had only 3 weeks left of school and was adjusting well to her cast. In mid-June, Pam and Jim invited Gerald and Gwen for dinner. After a lively meal of baby back ribs and homemade ice cream, Jim brought up Sherilyn's recovery. Pam reported that the cast would likely come off next month, barring complications. Jim and Pam then revealed their plans for a week-long trip to Cancun in early August and wanted Sherilyn to join them. Gwen was skeptical about the cost, but Jim explained that adding one more ticket to their 2 cabins wouldn't be too expensive, and they'd drive to the coast to board the ship. Sherilyn eagerly pleaded for the trip, and Gwen, though initially concerned about the cost, was reassured when Jim said it would be about $1,000 plus some extra for spending money. Gerald supported the idea, and Gwen, seeing the value and excitement, agreed it was a great opportunity. Gerald reassured Gwen that they could afford the trip, and Sherilyn had saved money by helping him. Gwen, intrigued, asked Jim how long he'd been planning this. He admitted they'd been considering it for a while, but kept it quiet. Gwen agreed Sherilyn could go, provided she continued to improve and got a passport. She handed over the application and added that they needed to discuss things at home. Back home, Gwen and Gerald talked over coffee. Gwen was curious about how long Gerald had known about the trip. He revealed he'd known since Sherilyn's accident, but they had only recently finalized plans. They discussed splitting costs, and Gerald suggested Gwen use her vacation to volunteer at a picturesque village in central Washington. Gwen was intrigued but wanted details. Gerald explained that volunteering would cover the cost of staying there, though travel expenses remained. With the help of travel points from Jim, the trip would cost about $500 each. Gwen was excited by the idea of a break and agreed to go if Gerald covered Sherilyn's trip. Gerald showed Gwen the confirmation email for their volunteering stint, which included tasks like gardening, cleaning, or working with children. Gwen chose gardening, delighted with the arrangement. By July 4th, all plans were set, and both Sherilyn's trip and Gwen's volunteer vacation were ready to go. The month passed quickly, with everyone eagerly anticipating the upcoming adventures. Gwen had new questions for Gerald almost daily, but since he'd never been to the retreat before, he didn't have many answers. They decided to follow the retreat's advice and take things as they came. The Thursday before their trip, Gwen's parents visited, and Gerald met them for the first time. They all enjoyed a pleasant evening together. On Friday, Gerald picked up Gwen for their flight. She relaxed once the plane was in the air and remarked how real the trip felt. 2 weeks later, as they flew home, both reflected on their amazing time. Gwen loved the village life, including the dinners, craft shops, and pottery classes. Gerald enjoyed working on old buildings and the peaceful evenings. They felt tired but content. As they neared home, Gwen asked Gerald to stop at a park. She expressed how much she loved the trip and hoped to return next summer with Sherry and maybe Jenny. Gerald agreed, suggesting they talk to Jim and Pam about it once Jim's re-election campaign was over. Back home, they decided to go out for Mexican food instead of cooking. Sherilyn and Jenny shared stories about their cruise, and Gerald and Jim discussed next year's plans. Gerald suggested renting an RV to visit the retreat as guests, with an estimated cost of $800 for all four. Jim and Pam were on board with the idea, and they planned to start saving and organizing. When school started, both girls adjusted well to high school. Sherilyn, despite being sidelined from volleyball to help her leg heal, took on a role as an assistant coach. Jenny and Sherilyn continued growing and maturing, and Gwen and Gerald continued their routines and tutoring. As the holiday season approached, Gwen and Sherilyn quietly shopped for gifts, while Gerald maintained his usual routine, all excited for their future adventures. On Christmas morning, Gerald found a shiny new grill with a smoker and rotisserie outside his house, along with tire tracks from Jim's van and a note from Santa Claus. He brought 2 big boxes to breakfast at Gwen's house. Sherilyn squealed with joy when she unwrapped a new tablet, perfect for school. Gwen, encouraged by her mother, discovered a new computer and printer in her box, a welcome upgrade from her old, troublesome setup. She hugged Gerald, grateful for his thoughtfulness. After breakfast, Gwen's parents left for home, and the girls played with their gifts. Gerald and Gwen relaxed on the porch with coffee. Gwen, sounding nervous, brought up a personal topic. She admitted she wanted to start dating again, asking if Gerald would be interested. Gerald, blushing and struggling to find words, finally confessed he had wanted to ask her out for a long time but never felt the moment was right. He admitted he'd thought about it since before her divorce and was now eager to see where things might go. Gwen was relieved and happy when Gerald asked her out for New Year's Eve. She agreed, thrilled by the idea. From inside, someone called out, "Gerald, it's time to make a move!" Gerald joked about finding a babysitter for Jenny, but decided they could drop her off at the shelter for the evening. As they shared a brief, tender moment, Gwen and Gerald blushed, but the warmth between them was undeniable. They decided to take things slow, enjoying their newfound connection with simple gestures of affection. From then on, they were often seen holding hands or with their arms around each other, maintaining a steady pace in their evolving relationship. That summer, the girls shared a room at the retreat and fully embraced every class and adventure, making new friends along the way. Gwen and Gerald focused on their past year's skills. Gerald worked on pottery while Gwen wove placemats and runners. They also contributed to community projects and joined the evening vespers, though Jenny took part in the choir and even performed a solo. As the retreat ended, everyone was eager to extend their stay but needed to return home before Election Day. Jim, running for re-election with only one challenger, felt confident. The girls were excited to learn they could volunteer or become camp leaders in college and promised to return. Back home, Gwen and Gerald maintained their weekly outings, movies, local festivals, and concerts. They often brought the girls along, but they would usually wander off, leaving Gwen and Gerald to enjoy their time together. For Thanksgiving, Gwen's parents invited everyone for dinner, and Gerald contributed homemade bread and rolls. They enjoyed a hearty meal and a football game before heading home with leftovers. On Christmas morning, Gerald surprised Gwen with a large box. After breakfast, he hinted that something was outside. Gwen was stunned to find a Jeep, a gift from Gerald and Jim. Though she was excited, Gerald playfully withheld the keys, saying they would be her mom's gift until she turned 16 and got her license. Despite her protests, he insisted on the rules for driving and promised to help her practice once she was ready. As Gwen went outside to admire her new Jeep, another Jeep pulled up with Jenny's new car. The two girls celebrated together, while Jim jokingly asked for more than just coffee, preferring to watch rather than teach a teenager to drive. Gerald stepped outside, laid down the driving rules, no harming others' property or crashing the car without replacing it, and then joined in the celebration. The girls eagerly followed Gerald's driving rules, taking turns with Sherilyn driving first. They drove for 30 minutes before switching places with Jenny, who drove them home. Gerald reminded them that they could only drive with a parent until they had their licenses. Both girls understood and were excited about their new Jeeps. Afterward, Gerald handed Gwen her Christmas gift, a loom with yarn and tools, just like the one she used at the retreat. Gwen was thrilled and hugged Gerald, while Sherilyn presented Gerald with a new chainsaw. Gerald admired it and gave both girls a hug in return. As Gwen and Gerald enjoyed a quiet evening together, Gwen noticed Gerald deep in thought. She joined him on the porch with a cup of coffee. Gerald confessed that he'd always loved her and asked her to marry him, presenting a ring. Gwen, moved to tears, accepted, saying she had loved him for a long time. Their children cheered them on from the living room, urging them to enjoy the moment. A week later, they went to Gwen's New Year's party, and after spending the night together, Gerald stayed until noon the next day. When Gwen picked up Sherilyn, she was eager to know about the wedding plans. Gwen mentioned they hadn't set a date yet. Sherilyn, now more aware of her rapidly changing life, made Gerald reflect on how fast she was growing up. Spring passed quickly, and Gerald and Gwen took their time planning the wedding. Both girls excelled in school, with Jenny and Sherilyn ranking 3rd and 4th in their class. Gerald faced his biggest surprise in April when Sherilyn was asked to the junior-senior prom. Although initially hesitant, he was reassured by Gwen that the boy was a good kid, thanks to her past experience with him. That night of the prom, Gerald felt uneasy until he knew Gwen was safely home and in bed. After a sip of scotch, he finally headed to bed himself. In the spring, Gerald quietly began adding a new section to his house, creating a U-shaped layout with a patio, deck, new bedroom, and bathroom. Sherilyn noticed the changes, which included a grill and brick oven. Gerald and Gwen planned to move into his house first, then sell her house and 2 acres of land, while keeping the remaining 3 acres for an orchard. Gerald busied himself with moving fences and planting trees, including pecans, plums, pears, and blackberries. When Jim and Pam took their daughters on a 2-week East Coast road trip, Gwen and Gerald returned to the village for another working vacation. They prepared thoroughly, buying supplies and packing a truck for the barge. Gerald drove to Seattle to pick up Gwen, and they continued their journey to the village, where they were warmly welcomed and enjoyed their stay. During their trip, Gwen expressed a desire to marry in the village, which Gerald found appealing. Their 2 weeks ended, and they returned to their daily routines, with Sherilyn and Jenny excelling in their junior year and taking on leadership roles. Back home, Gerald was surprised to find a crowd of news reporters and a prominent figure at his house. The man, a representative and agriculture committee member, spoke about the benefits of farm aid, which was stalled in Congress. Gerald, puzzled by the representative's understanding of the situation, asked who he was. The response identified him as a key figure in agriculture legislation. "What do you mean?" Mike Powell from TXT News asked Gerald, who explained that he owned the property and had never used government aid. Mike asked to tour the place and record a video. Gerald agreed, despite few people showing interest in his work. Gerald showed Mike around, pointing out the trees and bushes he'd planted, his garden's growth over the years, the new orchard, and the buildings he'd constructed using recycled materials and second-hand equipment. He insisted he had never received any government funding for his farm. After the tour, Mike thanked Gerald and told him to watch the news that night. Gerald didn't think much of it and went to Gwen's house for dinner. Gwen reminded him to watch the 6 o'clock news, as he was featured. As Gerald and Gwen watched, the news highlighted Gerald's self-built property and his claim of not receiving government aid. Meanwhile, Gerald's ex-wife, preparing for an event, was irritated by the news, which cast a shadow on Tommy Fielder, a powerful figure she needed for her husband's political aspirations. Her husband, annoyed, argued about the importance of keeping Fielder's favor and suggested that if she wanted a farm like Gerald's, she should move back alone. She retorted, demanding a nice place if she were to return, and left for the evening. The news then featured an interview with the local sheriff, who praised Gerald's integrity and claimed that no small farmer in the county received aid from the agriculture department. The sheriff's remarks hinted at potential political ambitions, which led to speculation about his future. As the news segment ended, Gerald's ex-wife left, expressing disdain for her husband's political maneuvers and concerns about their children. Gerald, unaware of the political machinations, continued focusing on his work while Gwen and Sherilyn were thrilled with his recent TV appearance. Tommy Fielder's name had gained national attention, leading to discussions about the Farm Bill and the Agriculture Committee. One Sunday in early December, Gerald proposed a Christmas plan, spending the holidays in the village and getting married there in a small, intimate ceremony. Gwen and Sherilyn loved the idea, and by evening, Gerald had arranged for them to obtain a marriage license in Seattle before heading to the village for the ceremony on Christmas Day. They'd return home on January 2nd. 2 days later, a well-dressed man arrived at Gwen's door. Introducing himself as a real estate agent, he presented an offer from a buyer interested in purchasing 10 to 15 acres of their land for $150,000 per parcel. Gerald declined, stating that only Miss Lambert's 2 acres were for sale. The agent increased the offer to $200,000 per parcel, but was still turned down. Gerald, troubled by the unsolicited offer, called Jim, who knew nothing of the buyer but promised to keep an ear out for any news. Gerald and Gwen speculated about the unusually high offer given their property's lower market value and decided to wait for more information. Gerald didn't realize the impact of recent events until summer, focusing instead on his usual routine while Gwen looked forward to Christmas. They flew to Seattle, explored Pike Place Market, and obtained their marriage license. Surprised by Seattle's warmth, they traveled by train through snowy hills to the village, arriving 3 days before Christmas. In the village, Sherilyn quickly made friends with a local boy who taught her skiing and snowshoeing. Gwen spent time working on a loom to create a blanket for Gerald, while Gerald helped refurbish an empty dorm. Their Christmas surprise came when Jim, Pam, and Jenny arrived to attend the wedding. They planned to visit Pam's sister in Seattle afterward, with Jenny staying behind to learn skiing and snowboarding. On Christmas morning, Gerald was directed to stay away from Gwen until the ceremony. Despite the playful punishment from Sherilyn, Gerald took a peaceful walk in the woods, reflecting on the past 9 years. Dressed casually in jeans and a flannel shirt, he felt calm and content as he prepared for the wedding. The ceremony was simple yet heartwarming. Gwen, in a lace-trimmed blouse and veil, joined Gerald in the chapel, where the villagers, Jim and Pam, looked on. Sherilyn, wearing a light green blouse, held a bouquet of fake flowers. After the ceremony, snowball fights and a meal of grilled salmon and vegetables followed. The wedding cake, with its green icing and bride and groom topper, was quickly devoured. The couple's honeymoon was brief but joyful. A short walk by the creek in the crisp mountain air was all they needed before their hands grew too cold. After their cozy wedding, Gerald and Gwen enjoyed a week of skiing in the village, with Gwen discovering a love for the sport. On New Year's Day, they traveled to Seattle, where Jim and Pam picked them up and took them to Pam's sister's welcoming home. They flew back the next morning, rested, and resumed their routines. Gerald began moving Gwen's belongings into his house, starting with the beds. By week's end, most of Gwen's things were settled, and Gerald began selling or donating items the girls no longer needed. At school, Sherilyn and Jenny excelled, with Jenny securing second place and Sherilyn third in their class. As the new top student struggled, Jenny and Sherilyn soon reclaimed the top spots. In March, a town announcement revealed a new highway would be built. Initially, Gerald wasn't concerned as the highway would bypass his property. But when surveyors began measuring nearby land, Gerald learned they needed to work their way toward his property. He showed them his survey markers, making their job easier. As summer approached, Jim and Pam offered Jenny and Sherilyn a trip to Italy, which they eagerly accepted. Meanwhile, Gerald and Gwen planned their own 2-week visit to the village. 2 weeks before their trip, Gerald and Gwen received letters informing them that the state planned to seize their property for the new highway. A meeting in September would allow them to contest the decision. In Jim's office, Jim expressed confusion over why their property was on the list and mentioned a past high offer for their land from an unknown buyer. Jim advised Gerald that challenging the decision might be futile due to the powerful forces behind the project. The state would make a final offer after the hearing, specifying the amount they'd pay and when they'd take ownership. Gerald and Gwen were left with little hope of retaining their land. Jim reassured Gerald that they could keep their equipment and improvements, even move or destroy their house if they chose. However, he warned that any fire started would make Gerald responsible for damage to neighbors. Jim chuckled, and Gerald suggested he should consider running for governor due to his knack for deal-making. Jim confided that he was being considered for Congress and asked Gerald to keep it confidential. Gerald offered his support. That evening, Gerald shared Jim's news with Gwen. She agreed to face the uncertainty together and suggested waiting until after the final meeting to decide their next steps. They decided to keep their situation quiet to avoid disrupting Sherilyn's last year of high school. The next day, Sherilyn returned from shopping to find Gerald and Gwen preparing a late-night meal. Despite her teasing, they enjoyed a relaxed evening together. They left for their trip that evening, driving until exhausted. They took an early morning boat to their destination. Gwen proposed an idea for their future, which Gerald enthusiastically supported. They spent their time volunteering and exploring the area, ultimately deciding to stay 3 extra days to meet locals. Upon returning home, they were surprised to find Sherilyn and Jenny with trendy new hairstyles and speaking Italian, a cheerful welcome home for their parents. Sherilyn and Jenny excitedly greeted their parents, chatting animatedly about their trip. Once home, Sherilyn unpacked while Gwen started dinner. Afterward, Sherilyn gave Gwen a beautiful antique necklace and Gerald a Roman bronze coin and a measuring tool supposedly used by Leonardo da Vinci. Gerald was thrilled, and Gwen joked that the tool would keep him quiet. Sherilyn then shared her news. She and Jenny had decided to attend Seattle University, which had offered them half scholarships. Pam's sister had facilitated this, and the cost with the scholarship would be comparable to their current school. Gwen and Gerald were supportive, though Gerald was surprised by the choice of a smaller private college. As they discussed the university, Gerald brought up the highway issue. They explained that the state planned to take their land and demolish their homes, which they had decided not to contest. Sherilyn was excited about their plans and the new opportunities. Gwen reassured her that they had only recently made these decisions and hadn't shared them with Jim yet. They decided to tell Jim and Pam about the highway project and the land deal after the big meeting next month, once all the details were clear. Sherilyn was excited about starting school and their new plans. Gerald joked about long graduation speeches, and Gwen playfully hit him for his humor. School started with its usual chaos, and Gerald opted out of tutoring this year due to other commitments. 2 weeks later, a City Hall meeting revealed that the state would pay $25,000 per acre for the land, with ownership changing hands at midnight on May 31st of next year. The speaker confirmed that people could take their belongings but should remove or protect anything left behind. Gerald received official confirmation that the deal was strictly for the land as he expected. He was also notified of a $10,000 check and an additional $50,000 payment due after the land deal, with a final payment date set for early June next year. Gerald traveled to Washington to finalize the deal, signing the papers and receiving a check. He planned to return home after unloading his items. On his way back, he stopped for lunch and overheard 2 men discussing why they were watching him. It turned out their boss had a history with Gerald and was interested in his property, though the boss was also focused on running for governor. The conversation hinted at some personal stakes involving the boss's ex-wife. The two men at the cafe discussed a scheme involving Gerald's property. The boss had tried to buy the farm but was refused, so he used connections to add it to the highway project list. The plan was to take control of the land at midnight, then swiftly declare it extra, allowing the boss to acquire it. This would help him secure a spot as governor while his ex-wife moved in with her companion. The men, tasked with monitoring the property, had to keep everything confidential to protect their jobs. Gerald, overhearing this, was troubled. He went home, shared the disturbing news with Gwen, and expressed his resolve to confront the situation. He was determined not to let the boss ruin his life further, promising Gwen that he'd focus on their future once they left this place. Despite the weight of the situation, Gerald celebrated Sherilyn's impressive SAT scores with a family dinner. In early November, he made a final trip to Washington, sorting through belongings and donating or shipping items to avoid suspicion. Over winter, he continued to manage the move discreetly, preparing for the girls' college start in June. As spring approached, Gerald and Gwen had nearly emptied their house, quietly handling the transition as their daughters were nearby. Gerald had noticed two men lingering around and suspected they were the same ones he'd overheard. With Jim's help, he arranged to move the men away from the farm one morning and had a 20-foot shipping container delivered to his barn. He and Gwen spent days loading their larger items into the container, leaving only clothes and a few small things for their truck. They had discreetly sold Gwen's car to avoid drawing attention. Early one morning, the container was picked up and on its way out before the black car showed up. Gerald made sure not to let the men trace anything leaving the farm. Jim and Pam were aware of the plan, though Gerald only shared partial details with Jim, who never pressed further. By spring, Jim announced his run for Congress, with Pam planning their move to Washington, D.C., while keeping their local house. Gerald and Gwen helped furnish their local home. Graduation was approaching, and the girls were excited but focused on their speeches. 2 days after graduation, they planned to celebrate all night before leaving. As the ceremony began with pomp and circumstance, Gerald, Gwen, Pam, and Jim watched proudly. The superintendent introduced the co-valedictorians, Sherilyn Lambert and Jennifer Sanders, who took the stage together. They surprised everyone by delivering a joint speech. Jennifer spoke first, thanking teachers, friends, and parents for their support. Sherilyn followed, expressing her gratitude to her parents and especially her mother. Then both girls addressed the crowd together, acknowledging Gerald as their mentor and supporter and their guiding light. The crowd erupted in applause as Gerald sat in stunned surprise. Gwen held his hand tightly, sharing in the honor. The graduates tossed their hats in the air and the choir sang "You'll Never Walk Alone," marking the end of a memorable ceremony. As Gerald stood in the lobby, still trembling from the ceremony, Gwen guided him to wait for the girls. He was lost in thought when a young woman approached and tugged at his shirt. "Mr. Murphy, you probably don't remember me, but I'm Susie Pendleton. You helped me in 3rd grade." "Of course I remember you, Susie. You've grown up so much," Gerald replied, recognizing her bright smile. Susie thanked him for his past support, saying it had made a big difference in her life. "I'm graduating next year and I'm working hard, even if I'm not as outstanding as Sherilyn or Jennifer. I'm proud of you, Susie. Your effort matters just as much as anyone else's," Gerald reassured her. "Do you remember Miss Lambert? She's my wife now," Gwen greeted Susie warmly. "Gerald's right. We're all proud of you. Keep up the great work." Susie shared that she loved reading and was excelling in it, though math and science were still challenging. Gerald smiled at her progress. Just then, Sherilyn joined them. "Hi, Susie. Your story for the newspaper was amazing. I laughed and cried. Keep up the great work." "I will. Thanks for everything," Susie replied, then said goodbye and headed towards her parents. Gwen and Gerald watched her leave, feeling a mix of pride and emotion. Sherilyn and Jennifer soon joined them, teasing Gerald about his earlier speech. They decided it was time to head home and relax. As they walked out into the lovely spring night, Gerald asked Gwen about starting her book. She smiled and said she'd begin once they were settled again. "I'll hold you to that," he said. "All I want is for you to be close." They left the auditorium hand in hand, looking forward to their future. For the rest of the week, Gerald stayed busy, handling tasks and checking every corner of the house and barn to ensure everything was packed. On the morning of the 31st, they had breakfast, said their goodbyes, and left their home for the last time. After driving 500 miles, they stopped at a small, inexpensive motel. At 11 o'clock, Gerald told Gwen he was going for a walk, feeling ready to embark on their new chapter. Gerald was gone for just 15 minutes. He used the time to call a number from a disposable cell phone before tossing it in a cafe dumpster. Returning to their room, he and Gwen shared a warm and comforting night. They packed their things into the truck, had a quick breakfast, and left before 7 o'clock, focusing only on their future. Meanwhile, the boss woke his wife early, insisting they visit the new farm immediately. Despite her reluctance, she got dressed and woke their daughter, who had noticeable marks on her neck and chest. With coffee in hand, they headed to the limo, and the guards confirmed they had lost Gerald and Gwen's trail earlier. As they arrived at Gerald's property, they were shocked by the devastation. The house, barn, and orchard were all destroyed. The boss's wife was furious, and he called 911, giving vague directions to the sheriff. As he approached the barn, he found an envelope with a note inside. "You took away my life once, and now you tried again. Forget you." The boss's daughter called out to her mother, revealing 2 boxes of letters from Gerald, including a recent one wishing them well. Furious at the lies, she decided to leave and pursue a divorce, taking the boxes with her. The boss's wife confronted him, accusing him of knowing the truth about Gerald's place and vowing to claim everything she could. She demanded a ride back to the hotel to collect their belongings. As they drove off, narrowly avoiding the sheriff, Jim arrived to find a mess. Jim, who had feared for Gerald's safety, was surprised to find a stranger at the scene. The stranger explained the state had purchased the land and implied someone had manipulated the situation for financial gain. Jim was informed that the land was legally transferred to the state and then bought by another party. Jim's laughter echoed as he drove back to town, amused by the chaotic scene at Gerald's old property. The sheriff had confirmed that Gerald had acted within his rights, but Jim's frustration was palpable. He had the fire department on the way and arranged a cab for the boss, who was left to deal with the mess. Back at the hotel, the boss ordered his worker to call for their ride and then made urgent calls. He demanded an investigator and was willing to pay extra for a thorough job. His next call was to discuss bribes for information. When the limo arrived, the boss and his team went over what they knew about Gerald's truck and its movements. With only a few local spots visited, the trail was cold. Jim advised that Gerald and Gwen were traveling and likely looking for a new place to settle. The investigator arrived at 4 o'clock and gathered minimal details: a truck and its license plate. The following morning, the investigator learned that the truck had been sold in Santa Fe. This led to the conclusion that Gerald and Gwen were heading west. The investigator focused on flights from Santa Fe, narrowing it down to 3 possible couples. After further investigation, he zeroed in on a couple headed to Denver. Despite over 100 matching descriptions, this lead was the best chance of finding them. The investigator reevaluated his options after Denver proved unhelpful and returned to Santa Fe to restart his search. He focused on coastal Oregon and Washington, marking areas south of Seattle as promising due to their suitability for gardening and the preference for warmer climates. He used an insurance database to search for pickup trucks, knowing this would take time, and also scoured local news and social media for any leads on Gerald and Gwen. His search revealed little, aside from official notices of their divorces and a brief article about their vow renewal. However, he found a marriage license in Seattle and a scholarship notice for their daughter at Seattle University. This suggested they were living within 100 miles of Seattle. To confirm their location, he planned to track vehicle registrations and financial activities, though accessing financial records without inside help was challenging. He arranged to meet the boss the following day for an update on Gerald's finances. When the lawyer arrived, he brought disappointing news. Gerald had recently secured a $250,000 loan, which was used to pay off existing debts and fund investments. He had moved $150,000 into his investment account and took $100,000 in cash, all traced to land sales. The bank confirmed the legitimacy of the transactions, and despite attempts to halt the transfer, the state required proof of wrongdoing to investigate further. The lawyer revealed that Gerald's investment account had been accumulating money for years without withdrawals, and it had been moved to private banking due to its substantial balance. For the past decade, Gerald had lived entirely on cash, avoiding any paper trail, while his wife managed a simple paycheck-to-bills routine. 4 years ago, she started saving modestly, withdrawing only around Christmas. The lawyer noted their low profile, saying Gerald's financial footprint was minimal and difficult to trace. Turning to personal matters, the boss mentioned his wife's top lawyer was handling her divorce, hinting at a possible Las Vegas move with her new partner. The boss seemed amused, acknowledging the situation's complexity. The lawyer, hoping for a break from the chaos, was relieved not to hear from him again. The investigator reported to his client about Gerald's truck sale in Santa Fe and his belief that Gerald and Gwen had moved near Seattle. Despite thorough searches, the couple remained elusive, their cash transactions carefully hidden. The client, intent on resolving his divorce, instructed the investigator to continue searching, handing over cash and contact details for his next steps. By late July, the investigator's report revealed no concrete leads. Gerald and Gwen's movements remained untraceable, suggesting they might be in Canada or an island. The client, overwhelmed by his divorce and political scandals, never read the report. As news of the client's legal troubles and impending federal prison sentence spread, Gerald and Gwen continued their quiet lives. They sold Gerald's old truck in Santa Fe, bought a sturdy replacement from a military surplus, and journeyed to a village boat dock. Throughout their travels, they enjoyed simple pleasures, including homemade meals and music from a small CD player. Their final stop was a meeting with a couple planning retirement, wrapping up their journey while sticking to their well-laid plans. Gerald and Gwen were eager to buy a 20-acre property with apple orchards and space for vegetables. The house, while older, was solid and featured 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a pantry. After discussing their plans with the owner, they agreed on a deal. Gerald would pay $10,000 up front to store belongings in the barn, followed by a $50,000 down payment on the house the next year, with the balance due in 2 years. The owner, pleased, gave them a key to the gate and barn. After securing the property, Gerald and Gwen took a boat to the village. They arrived early, 6 weeks ahead of their official start in September, and were welcomed warmly. Their help was invaluable during the busy summer season. They asked Sherilyn not to visit until August due to space constraints. Sherilyn and Jenny adapted well to college life and made new friends. In August, the girls visited, and they parked Carolyn's Jeep at a secure lot near the boat dock. They enjoyed a boat ride together before Sherilyn handed over her Jeep's keys and mentioned the parking challenges at school. They decided to leave one Jeep for Gerald and Gwen for their weekend trips. As they prepared to leave, Sherilyn shared her recent visit to her father in prison, where he expressed regrets and advised her to move on. Despite the brief and emotional meeting, Sherilyn planned to continue her life in Seattle. Gerald reassured Gwen about their daughter, and Sherilyn expressed gratitude for her supportive parents. Gerald and Gwen took up their roles at the property. Gerald handled maintenance, and Gwen managed guest activities. They arrived early to learn from the outgoing staff. By late August, they had moved into a staff chalet, and they began setting up their home with small appliances from storage. The girls visited during winter break, though infrequently due to the long travel time. In late July, Sherilyn returned for her volunteer program with a young man named Robert Gerald, who quickly made a good impression. Gwen noticed Robert's similarities to Gerald and his affection for Sherilyn. This summer, Jeannie stayed in Seattle for an internship, while Sherilyn's presence and Robert's arrival brought new dynamics to their lives. Robert, from a nearby small town, had heard of the village but had never visited. He worked in his family's orchard and joined Sherilyn in various activities while helping Gerald whenever needed. After the school year, Robert and Sherilyn spent several days with his parents before joining Gwen and Gerald for the holidays. Their close bond was evident, and Gwen and Gerald treated them as a couple. Robert, 2 years ahead of Sherilyn, was set to graduate in economics and planned to pursue a doctoral program at the University of Washington. Sherilyn, inspired by him, switched her major to economics. Their holiday visit was short but pleasant, and they returned during spring break. Gerald proposed to Carolyn, who accepted, and they planned to marry after her graduation in 2 years. For now, they would live together in his city apartment. Gwen and Gerald began preparing for life after the village, finalizing the purchase of a new home in July from an elderly couple. Gwen earned her teaching certificate in Seattle in June and was offered a fall job in a lakeside town. In August, they moved into their new home, with Carolyn and Robert helping to unpack and prepare for the fall harvest. They said goodbye to friends, trained their replacements, and returned to the city. Gerald's new truck, picked up by Robert, awaited them at the dock. They drove home, where they were greeted by Sherilyn, Robert, and his parents. A large dinner was prepared, and the kitchen buzzed with warmth and laughter. 2 weeks after moving, they visited the local farmer's market. Gerald sold 20 loaves of bread and most of his rolls, while Gwen sold 35 of her pecan treats, quickly becoming a local favorite. Robert's parents, living nearby, frequently visited the market and became close with Gerald, who learned about orchard care from Robert's father. Gwen started teaching in September and gained respect from her colleagues, while Gerald focused on gardening and building a deck and brick oven. In mid-October, Gwen shared her concern about a quiet student, Jillian, who had been removed from her troubled home. Gerald agreed to support her decision, and they prepared for a visit from Miss Trimble, a family services representative. The following week, Gerald and Gwen became certified foster parents. Just before Thanksgiving, Jillian Michaels, a quiet girl, came to live with them. Sherilyn quickly befriended her new foster sister. By mid-January, Gerald and Gwen were named Jillian's permanent guardians, and a year and a half later, they officially adopted her. On adoption day, Jillian looked at Gwen and called her Mom, and then turned to Gerald and called him Dad, her smile becoming a frequent presence. With Jillian now a part of their family, Gerald felt a deep sense of pride and safety, while Gwen was thrilled to embrace her roles as a wife and mother. Their family grew further when Sherilyn had a baby a year later, making Gwen a grandmother. Jillian now had a family she had always longed for: parents, a sister, and a nephew. Though life was calm, they cherished every small moment together, celebrating their new life as a family. Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.